The problem of rule of law and how to think about solutions. So one of the things that you'll notice about Alan is he had a seemingly inexhaustible energy. There he is in the ICU dying, and all he can think about is how he's going to finish that last book. So I will be, at my own request and also Marilyn, his wife's, finishing that up for Alan, and I promise you that we will have a presentation of that material at some point in one of our future events. So we'll find out what he was thinking in his final book. But I think it's also appropriate, the comments I had in mind for starting us off today also are very much inspired by Alan. I worked with Alan for a long time on a variety of issues, and the thing about him was that he was really an optimist. He was an optimist about democracy. Those of you who know the Meltzer Richard JPE article, which was a real theoretical breakthrough of thinking about how partisan back and forth happens in a democracy, will recognize the optimism that comes out of that article. In other words, there was a famous 18th century Scottish philosopher who said that democracy would collapse and be impossible to sustain, because as soon as you got enough people in charge, you'd have majoritarian tyranny that would try to take all the possessions away from anyone who was producing anything, and therefore democracy would be unsustainable. And of course, Meltzer and Richard, their article explains why that isn't happening. By the way, some work that John Wallace has done, theoretical work, about how societies evolve and how democracies can be constructed to be stable, and why democracies are constructed in the first place, coming out of environments controlled by elites, which is part of that same puzzle, are related to that question. So the thing about Alan that was so optimistic was he really believed in democracy. He believed that people were capable of governing themselves. But what worried him was not democracy. What worried him was the collapse of the rule of law. Because democracy, I think I can say he would agree with me, really can't survive without the rule of law balancing it and making sure that the outcomes of the democratic process are constrained. And so it's that same optimism that we are continuing with in having faith that preserving the rule of law is an essential part of our democracy, and it's really the background motivation, I think, for all of the scholarship that we're promoting here at this initiative. So there's a connection between that optimism and this session today. And what I want to emphasize that we're learning from all these historical studies that we're commissioning, and all three of the papers today document enormous changes that have happened in administrative law over a long period of time. And what's interesting is change does happen. And some of these changes, at least some of them, are for the better, or some of them maybe not. So change is possible. We started off our initiative with some papers by Richard Epstein and Chris DeMuth and others, Jennifer Arlen, pointing out sort of some problems with the current structure of the administrative state and how recent those problems have arisen, really since the 1970s, and some of them even more recently. And that, again, reminds us that in our democracy, people can pay attention, people can notice change, and if they don't like the changes, they can do something about them. And so we didn't always have, as a legislative principle, that legislators' rule of law meant that they had to have legislation that gave opportunities that were equal to everyone. That, as John Wallace is going to explain to us, is something that's really happening in the middle of the 19th century. It's not something that came out of the Constitution or that was guaranteed or that was the general practice of our government. We didn't have the progressive sort of empowerment of the national government, even to do things that I think we would all agree are necessary, until reality, disciplined theory, and Alan is going to talk about that, and Harold will be talking about the way that administrative law has changed and what opportunities there might be now in the telecommunications arena. So without any further ado, I will turn the floor over to the speakers. I'll be chairing the session. You'll each have 20 minutes, and that will leave us plenty of time for general comments from the audience. So, John Wallace, floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Charlie and Mike. And so I want to talk today about the nature of limits and the concept of limited government. This is, Charlie just talked about constrained outcomes. We have a lot of ideas about it. So I'm going to, what are the limits on government? We have sort of the textual ones, enumerated powers, separation of powers, veto points, suffrage inclusion kinds of things. Those are kind of these mechanisms. We have structural limits like federalism. So Riker and Weingast have written about this, as have others. And then we have sort of the economic and social dynamics within the larger society. What are the forces that press on the government? And Charlie alluded to that if we have rules that say everybody can participate, you have to treat them all the same. Then when you pass the law, everybody who's affected is going to have an incentive to push back. And so I'm going to look at kind of what were the textual, structural, dynamic limits on government in the 19th century and how did they change and what were their effects. I'm really going to focus on the dynamic element of this. And the institutional arrangements in the 1840s that enabled these dynamic limits to emerge in a much more effective way. So the paper is now in its second version. The version that we had at our conference in February had a lot of history. And Charlie commented on the paper in February, and his opening comment was, I just want you to know that everything he says happened in this paper happened. Okay, so there's less of what happened in this version of the paper. In part to highlight sort of the conceptual framework that I'm working in which we conceive of societies in which the political system manipulates the economic system, manipulates economic privileges for political purposes. So this is not a world in which the economy is manipulating the political system. This is a world in which the political system is manipulating the economy. And what does that mean? And I think there's sort of persistent patterns in both American history but in world history that reflect this. And this is essentially, the arrow runs from politics to economics. And that makes problematic this dynamic relationship for economic interest affecting politics in an independent way, if in fact economic interests are being manipulated by the political system in a systematic way. So what I want to try to do is to show you how we get to a world that looks like that. Okay? And this is in fact the constrained outcome, in which one of the constraints that operates on the legislature or the government are, in fact, that when they do things that affect economic interests, the economic interests are able to push back. That is, there's this red arrow going from the right to the left. So that's where I'm trying to get to. I'm going to frame this empirically in terms of really bad outcomes that were really is in red here. So think of such situations like civil wars, coups, non-constitutional regime change, significant expropriation of property or persons. We were talking about reparations last night. This could be nationalization of an industry. It could be genocide. It could be ethnic cleansing. It could be lots of different things of expropriation. Another one is government defaults and financial disruption. We'll talk today about how the American states defaulted. We know that in the 21st century, when governments systematically default on their obligations, it has enormous impacts that go throughout society. And then the final one is blatant political manipulation of the economy, where people can see that the economy, privileges in the economy are being manipulated for political purposes. So I'm going to distinguish really bad outcomes from bad outcomes. Now, I know that's not very clever and catchy, but it's what I'm working with so far. So here's column A are really bad outcomes. Civil war, coups, non-constitutional regime change, expropriation, deliberate manipulation of the economy. Now column B are bad outcomes, but they're not really bad. So rent-seeking, redistribution of resources through taxing and spending, price controls, interference with markets, limits on civil and political liberties. Many times in economics when we talk about regulation, the effects of regulation, everything we're talking about is in column B. Not column A. And what separates the United States from Mexico is column A events, not column B events. It's not that we've got less column B events, it's that we've eliminated the column A events. Okay, so how do we do that? And if you think about constrained outcomes and limits on government, these things are all outcomes in which the government, either because it caused the crisis by stepping over its limits, or it has to step over its limits because of the crisis, limits on government are eased or ignored. So we might have an emergency, we have a war. So we suspend some of the limits on government in the Constitution for the state of the emergency. And we hope when we go back that we go back to the original ones. I'm still getting frisked at the airport, so I'm not sure, whether that emergency is going to become normality. But these are the kind of things that really cause economies trouble, cause societies trouble, because they're more than just economic effects. So I want to put this in that context empirically. So the conceptual framework I'm going to talk about is laid out in a book I wrote with Doug North and Barry Weingast, Violence and Social Orders, Cambridge University Press, 2009. The subtitle is a very Northian, modest one, a conceptual framework for interpreting recorded human history. Just 300 pages, human history. So really the question that's right, not all of you, just recorded human history. So the main question is, how do societies with high levels of violence and conflict secure some measure of social order? And we know when we look around us right now, today, there are a significant number of societies that are in the midst of ripping themselves apart as we speak. So how do those societies create a modicum of social order in a situation in which violence is either active or is right under the surface? And so I'm going to give the logic of this very quickly. It's a pretty simple idea. Powerful individuals and organizations, and of course we want to talk about organizations because the violence that really matters is not individuals going out, it's organized violence in some sort of way. They have to reach some agreements to coordinate. Part of their agreements is going to be about violence, about not fighting, and part of the agreements are going to be about other things, about how they're coordinating. So how do they believe each other's promises not to be violent? And if we read human history, we know that there's lots of promises and lots of broken promises and lots of fighting as a result. So I'm going to use the word elites here. We talk about elites as if they were people that were born to rich parents, but in fact elites typically are people that head organizations and are in positions of power. They may not be the CEO, but they're a person who has control over resources. And the very simple way of doing this is that two elites, it could be Alan and I, we recognize each other's rights to the land, labor, and capital in the world we live in. So we split the world down the middle. Alan owns this half, I own this half. Sorry, you guys are serfs and peons. And the key here is that we're the residual claimants to your output. And if we fight, your output goes down. And we lose. So that gives us, in a simple kind of equilibrium sense, some expectations that there's a range of circumstances in which I can believe that Alan won't actually fight. Not because of me, but because of you. Okay? So what we're doing here is just saying the political system, our agreement is the political system, we're the selector, we're the powerful players. We're going to reach an agreement which manipulates the economy in order to create privileges that we can use to secure our relationship. If those rents that we're getting from our agreement are adversely affected by violence, then it's credible for us to believe that the agreement can be abided by, but only within a narrow range of circumstances. So this is what we call the logic of the natural state. And we call it the natural state. It's not the state of nature in Hobbes. It's the logic of the natural state because in recorded human history, it's very difficult to find societies that aren't organized along this pattern. The political system manipulates the economy and uses the rents from the manipulations to coordinate the political system. It's politics manipulating economics. Now, if you go back and read Bernard Bailyn's Ideological Origins of the American Revolution or any of the Republican and Whig thinking, you'll see that something like this is in the background. It really comes to the fore in Britain in the 18th century, when the British government expands the size of the government from 5% of GDP to 20% of the GDP because they're fighting the French. And they're raising taxes, they're borrowing money, they're doing all this stuff. And in fact, what's happening is the Americans and the British are saying this government is corrupt. Why? Because the king and Robert Walpole and the evil ministers are manipulating the economic interests of members of parliament in order to get them to belong to a coalition. It's politics manipulating economics. So when Americans revolt, one of the things we're saying is Britain is corrupt in this systematic sense. They're not saying people are venal. Right? They're saying they're being corrupted by the constitutional order of independent mixed government is being corrupted by this close association of the king and the parliament. And in some ways, figuring out our logic was in part and parcel trying to understand what the Whig and Republican theorists were saying. They weren't paranoid. They were actually describing the way the world works. So how do we systematically put that into being? So if we have all this logic, it's pretty clear that natural state coalitions are always fragile because the agreements always depend upon outcomes falling within this range of conditions. If Alan gets too powerful, he doesn't abide by the agreement anymore. He attacks me. And as a result, what turns out, and you can see it in the simple example, but more generally, what we get is the elites want to have rules. Once Alan and I have figured out a way to limit violence, we want the two sides of the room to trade with one another, because if you trade, we get specialization and division of labor, and we're the residual claimants. We're better off, okay? So we want growth in some sense. The problem is that the rules can't work against Alan and I. So we need identity rules. We need rules whose nature and enforcement depend upon the identity of the actor. Now that means that when conditions change and identities shift, the rules that we'd agreed to may no longer be workable. Okay? And so political arrangements become uncertain. And when that happens, when political things become uncertain, and they could become uncertain because the economy is changing, then really bad things can happen. So this is data taken from the Penwell tables. This is from a paper that I'm writing with Steve Broadberry, or series of papers I'm writing with Steve Broadberry about what we call shrink theory. So this says, if you take the Penwell tables data from 1950 to 2011, and you divide it in, for each country you take the percentage of years in which they grow, and the average growth rate when they're growing. So that's the growing part. And as you can see here, over 20,000 per capita income, they're the slowest growing group. Rich countries aren't rich because they grow fast. But they grow in the highest percentage of years, and there's no relationship between growth rates and income, but there's a monotonic relationship with the frequency of years in which you grow in income. And likewise, if we go here to shrinking, and the percentage of years in which you shrink is just 1 minus the percentage you grow, we can see a really strong relationship here between shrinking and growth and shrinking rates. Although actually all the developing world pretty much shrinks at about 5% when they shrink. And the big point is, these guys only shrink at 2%. So they don't shrink it very much. They don't shrink very often, and they shrink very little when they shrink. And that's why they're rich. And it turns out if you want to explain long-term economic growth, if you multiply these two columns together, you get the growth contribution and the shrinking contribution. Virtually all modern economic growth is explained on the shrinking side, not on the growing side. So if we really want to understand...
John, what is PCY?
Per capita income.
PCY?
Per capita income. Yeah.
Y is for income.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
It's an economist thing.
That's how we get the big bucks, Chris.
Yeah. you think it's I, that's...
you shouldn't have told them.
I'm so embarrassed.
So-
humiliated.
Okay, so the United States is a natural state in 1790. It has this political system that's manipulating the economy. Democracy does not make this any better, particularly. That's why Adams is arguing against the suffrage. If you give people the right to vote and it's easy to buy their votes, then you're just going to make this problem worse. You're not going to make it better. So this is still politics affecting economics. So after 1790, we get a democratic system. We widen the suffrage, and what do people want? They want to raise the value of their most important asset. That's land. What do they need to do to increase the value of the land? They need transportation and they need finance. They need banks and canals, basically. Turns out the federal government is incapable of reaching a political decision to do that for reasons that lots of people have written about. And people want canals and they want banks, and they know that if you create these large economic concentrations of capital or transportation, that's going to be subject to political manipulation. So it's a double-edged sword here. So banks are a clear example. I've written a lot about this. Charlie's written about this. A bunch of us have written about it. In Massachusetts in 1812, there were 23 banks, more banks in Massachusetts than pretty much the rest of the country combined. 20 of them were dominated by Federalists. 80% of people who we can identify as bank officers at some point in their life were a state legislature, so the bankers and the legislatures were exactly the same people. It wasn't they were they were the same people, okay? In New York, under the Albany Regency up until 1838, it was really difficult to get a bank charter to be born of a Democrat. Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, Alabama, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas all had some version of this dynamics, okay? So this was very common in banking. In the paper, I talk a lot about Indiana. Indiana needs canals because of its geography. It's in the middle of the country. In 1836, Indiana has a population of about 600,000 people and a budget of about $50,000 a year. It authorizes its canal fund to borrow $10 million in 5% bonds with a $500,000 a year interest burden for a state that makes $50,000 a year in revenue. Okay? Now, the way they do this politically is they shift from a flat land tax, per acre tax, to an ad valorem tax, which shifts the burden of taxation in the state. And it turns out that they do it in such a way is the places that are going to bear higher taxes are exactly the places that are going to get higher land values. And you can test this. This is looking at, this is just a simple diff and diff. This is all the counties from 1835 to 1837. Property values go up by $4 an acre. Land's worth about $6 an acre, so this is almost doubling. So here's the increase in improvement counties, here's non-improvement counties. So this is the amount that's attributable to having a canal in your county. And this is for terminus counties. This is where a canal, two canal routes or a canal and a highway or the Ohio River match. Their property values go up by $8 an acre. Non-terminus by almost $3, so $5.36 an acre. So what's happening in terminus counties, which is where the towns are, who don't have to pay much tax under a flat per acre land tax because it's per acre. It's 80 cents for 100 acres. You can have your whole town on 20 acres. They're going to be the ones that are going to get the benefits from the transportation improvement. They're the ones whose land values are going to go up, and they're the ones whose land values are being captured by the shift to ad valorem. Unfortunately, for reasons I don't have time to talk about, the canal system goes bankrupt because of the Morris Canal and Bank Company of New Jersey, which defaults on obligations to Indiana, and they have to stop working on the canals. And between 1837 and 1842, all the increase in land values is reversed, and Indiana goes bankrupt. In 1841, it defaults on its debts. Ultimately, it sells the canal to the bondholders for half the debt and pays it off. This is why they default. They didn't default because they were stupid. They defaulted because they knew if they built canals, land values would go up, and if the land values went up by enough, and they had an ad valorem property tax, they'd be able to pay for the canal out of the increased property values. But when property values went back down because they stopped building the canals, they went bankrupt. Now, nobody, and Charlie pointed this out in February, there was no venal corruption in Indiana that was on any large scale. Everybody in Indiana, this was a clear, transparent, open, democratic, majority rule process. Nobody was getting the wool pulled over their eyes in Indiana, okay? But they understood that politics had manipulated economics in order to get a majority. We'd messed around with people's property taxes and land values in order to get a majority to support this. Now, nobody was saying this was venally corrupt, but they were all saying this is systematically corrupt. In words that really meant something. They didn't use the word systematic or venal, they just used the word corruption. When they said Indiana was corrupt, they did not mean anybody broke any laws. They said our politics cannot stop this kind of corruption. Just like in Parliament and the King. That's what had led to getting majority rule support for Indiana to borrow 10 times its annual revenue in bonds to build a canal. So they changed their constitution. Indiana changed it in 1851. This slide is, they wanted to prevent states from doing things without raising taxes. They wanted to make sure voters followed the taxes. They had to eliminate chartering privileged corporations. They limited the state from borrowing money now and paying interest out of bonds later. That is, you have to raise taxes. You have to have a bond referendum if you want to borrow. And they eliminated tax breaks to privileged groups. In general, this led to what we call today general laws, or prohibitions on special and local legislation. 12 states wrote new constitutions in the 1840s. The details are in the paper. 10 of 11 states moved to some form of general incorporation law where anybody could get a corporate charter just by filing an administrative claim, a procedure. 8 out of 11 states moved to procedural debt restrictions, which required a bond referendum. 8 of 11 states moved to general tax laws. These were laws, okay, that required state legislatures to pass laws whose form treated everybody the same. And by 1900, almost every state had it, and there's some detail in the paper about the timing and what that tells us about things that are going on. Okay. Now, what's happening here is you can't make political manipulation of the economy impossible. It's always going to happen. And you definitely cannot prevent governments from doing stupid stuff. As we all know, I can't prevent me from doing stupid stuff, right? Much less the whole society. So what's happening is we need to change this dynamic interaction of economics and politics by prohibiting legislatures from manipulating the economy on certain dimensions. They didn't get rid of political manipulation of the economy, but they meant for certain very valuable things, like getting a bank charter, which was literally a license to print money, they had to treat everybody the same. So they couldn't limit economic entry, and they couldn't pass laws that informed treated people differently. So their ability to manipulate the economy was reduced. It was not eliminated. But on the other side, the ability of the economy to affect the polity was dramatically enhanced, because now anybody who the government moves against can form an organization to push back. That's what Charlie was just talking about. So we go from this situation, which I've been boring you with by repeating, I think, 12 times in the slides, to this slide. The green area is narrower than the blue. They have fewer tools to manipulate the economy. It isn't that they can't do it, they just have fewer tools. But this arrow now appears, and it appears with a vengeance. If the political system is manipulating people's economic interests, then when people vote their interests, they're going to vote the interests that have been manipulated. Democracy is not a cure for that kind of manipulation. Economic and social dynamics become much more effective at limiting government. How can we see this? Well, this is bad things that really happened before 1865. So I've got blatant political manipulation in column 1, general default in column 2, secession in column 3, and civil war in column 4, where every state should have an X in column 4, but I had some trouble with the tabs. This is a pretty well populated table. 8 states in the territory of Florida defaulted on their debts in 1841 and 42. 3 states narrowly avoided default. Most states manipulated their banking system. Lots of states manipulated property taxes and revenues to get their transportation improvements. So here's the before 65, and there's the 1865 to 1914. That's how many of these bad outcomes occurred after 1865. New Jersey still hands the Camden and Amboy Railroad, which runs between New York and Philadelphia, between Camden and Amboy, and they refuse to charter any other railroads that run parallel. They become known as the state of Camden and Amboy. And interestingly, New Jersey does not have a property tax. It has dividends from Camden and Amboy stock. So the limits that were imposed in the 1840s required legislators to pass laws that treated everybody the same. Obviously, we know they don't all do that, but the ability to manipulate the economy was less. These limits were effective in the sense that they prevented the economy from being manipulated on certain dimensions. They're not perfect. They're far from perfect, but they're way better than what a lot of societies have. And they also enabled us to write down a model of interest group politics in which the economy independently is affecting the polity, that red arrow. Without the institutional structures of general laws that treat everybody the same, the ability of interest groups to affect the polity is dramatically curtailed because the polity is affecting the interests. Bad outcomes stopped occurring. The reason Mexico is poorer than the United States is because it has lots of bad outcomes in a serial sense. We think, oh, secure property rights and good institutions increase productivity, but maybe they instead reduce shrinking and bad outcomes. And governments clearly became more limited. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, the next presenter is Alan Olmsted. And please speak into the microphones, I'm reminded, because we are recording this.
I should say at the beginning, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm glad everyone came out for this. And I want to tell you, Charlie gave a one-line introduction of my talk today. I need to co-author a book or article with Charlie because I always find that he has a better description of what I'm trying to say than I have. All right, while we're waiting for that, for those of you who were at Stanford and heard talk on this paper, I offered a lot of comparisons between what you'll hear about the Bureau of Animal Industry and the Interstate Commerce Commission, and I talked about the special interests, the debates, the key players, the court's effect on legislation, and so forth. I'm not going to do any of that today, given the time limitations. I'm just going to talk pretty much about the Bureau of Animal Industry. I also, for those of you who saw the earlier draft of the paper, would like to call to your attention, I added 4 pages or so on case law as a result of your asking. And in the talk, in response to Charlie's request, I've added something on the rule of law. It's at the end, and I may not get to it, but we'll see what goes on. This paper is derivative of and an extension of a book that I published with Paul Rohde a couple of years ago, Arresting Contagion. And for today's purposes, the general consensus, if you're in an economics class, a law school class, political science classes, really important national federal economic regulation began in 1887 with the Federal Trade or Interstate Commerce Act, and the ICC was the first important regulatory body. These are in quotes. They came out of important papers. The answer is on this, nope, that's not the case. The first important legislation was the Bureau of Animal Industry Act of 1884. No one has heard of it. When I gave this lecture at the USDA, no one had heard of it. Cato Institute, really? USDA. Yeah, in ERS. They might have heard of it over in their APHIS program. The Cato Institute recently published a long list of of USDA extensions, and noting there was nothing in the Constitution that allowed much of this, but it left off this act. And so I basically can argue that this is far more controversial and far more important and had a far greater effect on our understanding of the rule of law and how it evolved in the United States than almost anything else in that Cato list. It faced far more significant and more difficult problems than the ICC ever faced. And it was more intrusive, and it was far more important in terms of its impacts. Here we go. So I'm about to tell you an untold story about how some wise men created a political consensus and a bureaucracy to do a whole lot of things that had just never been done before in this country or in any other country. And they changed the powers of the federal government and the state governments in ways such that those new powers became norms. That's the story here. And it deals with livestock. So why do we care about livestock? Well, at the time that these events are taking place, the capital invested in livestock exceeded that invested in railroads in the United States. In the late 1870s, livestock and livestock products represented over 20% of U.S. merchandise exports, and it was a rapidly changing sector territorially in terms of technological change, higher productivity animals, industrial organization of the livestock industry, and what have you. Am I coming out in the mic okay? You getting me? All right. So the background circa 1880 to this 1884 act is animal diseases were getting worse, and they just weren't understood in almost all cases. There was a great disparity in knowledge where a few scientists on the leading edge of the germ theory of disease just had insights that most of the public didn't have, and certainly most legislators and administrative officials. The states had police powers, but unfortunately those diseases didn't pay any attention to state boundaries. There was a national problem. They migrated back and forth. There were special interests galore and an extraordinary amount of disease denial. The disease could be in your backyard, and people, including governors and legislators, would just say it doesn't exist. This is all being made up to hurt our interests, so forth. There was opposition and bickering and policy paralysis. Who's going to do it? Well, we have to do it. You do it. No, I don't want to pay for it. You pay for it. Who's in charge? Who pays? There was lying, cheating. If a disease broke out on one farm, that farmer had a great incentive to export his animals, send them across state lines, sell them, or butcher them and sell the meat so that people couldn't know that the meat had come from diseased animals. And there were very weak border controls. That was the state of affairs. There was a worsening disease environment for many reasons, but a new disease had entered the country in is there a pointer on here? In 1884, contagious bovine pleural pneumonia. I suspect a few of you have heard of this, a bacterial lung disease. It had caused havoc in England, across continental Europe, and would cause havoc in Australia, in East Africa, and it had high morbidity and mortality rates. Milk flows went down, for example. It was very hard to detect in the early stages, but contagious but early stages. The states, in fact, engaged in some heroic attempts to wipe it out, but shortly thereafter it would just reappear because it would come in from other states. And so this disease was of special concern. The legislative battles lasted a decade. This was not something that just happened. The delegation of police powers was a major issue in contention. As I say, the states had police powers. The federal government couldn't go into states. Special interests, in particular, southern cattlemen driving low-value longhorns north, and the Chicago stockyard interests, two major players in this debate, were firmly against it. It was a sort of a story of denialists versus scientists, in which the scientists were almost always right. And two diseases, Texas tick fever and contagious bovine pleural pneumonia, played the major role in these debates. The BAI law passed in May 1884 created a new type of scientific agency that was to do research, gather information, and report. But it had no powers as of this date to do much except try to get the states to work with them to do something. And a lot of the states, as I say, were in denial. The governors simply refused to cooperate. There were no cooperative agreements or anything of that sort. This agency, as part of its research function, created a biological laboratory, which was a gem. It created a string of fundamental scientific discoveries that changed human and animal medicine over the next 30 or 40 years. There's nothing comparable to it, say, in the early stages of the background to the National Institutes of Health Laboratory, things of this sort. There's nothing comparable to this in the whole history of federal human health initiatives up to this point. It was built for action with a chief as opposed to a committee. One-man rule was the idea of the supporters. But in the last votes to get it passed, it was absolutely gutted by the opponents. It was limited to 20 employees, and the budget was cut dramatically, and all reference to federal quarantines were eliminated. 10 minutes, okay. Its chief was Daniel Salmon, and he would guide it in its first decades. He's famous. One of the discoveries in that lab was salmonella that you've all heard of. Its impacts were that it set global precedents, increased productivity and wealth, and had tremendous effects on human health. Now, in this paper, I'm going to mention something on these three red diseases and just a tidbit on them. But these are the diseases that by World War II it eradicated in the United States. But more than this, it suppressed dozens of other diseases, including things like rabies and anthrax and a lot of diseases you just don't want around in your livestock populations. So the first crisis it faced was coming out of the gate when contagious bovine pleural pneumonia jumped the Alleghenies into the Midwest, and this shows a map over here of the BAI's agents trying to track down where it was. They're getting on trains, chasing after cattle cars, trying to get governors to participate, often being turned down. And in 1886, it hit Chicago. And they found it in the center of the city in large cattle populations that were associated with the city's distilleries. And this was next door to the Chicago stockyards. And if it got out of the stockyards, it would have been in the United States. There have been no suppressing it, given the technologies of the day. This is just a sampling of the kinds of headlines. And these were in New York as well as Chicago. And what happened was just an amazing 6 months of incompetency, where public health officials didn't want the milk from these dairy cows being sold. City police refused to enforce lawful orders. The governor and his people would say something one day and exactly the opposite the next day. The stockyard interests wanted the cattle slaughtered, but they wanted someone else to pay for it. They didn't want to hurt their reputation by having any meat come out of Chicago with this kind of label on it. The dairy interests refused to pay to have the cattle fed if they couldn't sell the milk. The distillery guys said, well, we'll let them starve. And this goes on and on and on. The only steady voice was the BAI, and in part because it was distant and not too easily infected by the local special interest. The BAI changes dramatically between 84 and 87. Appropriations Act in 86 and 87 vastly increased its budget and its powers. Early on, it could only advise and ask governors to help out or to work with them. In 87, they gained abilities, which I'll talk about on the next slide, to basically construct state-federal eradication programs. By 87, an agency that few people have heard of was consuming half of the USDA's budget. They managed to eradicate contagious bovine pleural pneumonia by 1892, and that was a world first. Never before had a major entrenched infection of this sort, infectious disease of this sort, been eradicated on a large scale. It had been done in counties, and England off and on had been able to do it, but on a huge scale like this was the first. And in doing it, they created what they called, what would later be called by epidemiologists, the Area Eradication Program. And this program, adjusted to fit specific needs, would be applied over and over again in the United States and then around the world on animal diseases, but also on human diseases. So the scientists that eradicated smallpox actually credited this 1880s, 1890s program with creating the image upon and the models upon which they built their eradication programs. I want to emphasize that these expanded powers took place under the Cleveland administration, and Cleveland is generally noted for being level-headed and a strong enforcer of the rule of law, and that the British and the Australians copied our program almost verbatim, but it took the Australians close to 100 years to eradicate the disease, over 100 years, because it got into their open ranges. Now, make no mistake, this was boots on the ground regulation. The USDA sent a letter to every governor in April of 1887. It was a form letter. Put a date on it, put your name on it, and sign it. And in between, the governor transferred his police powers to the federal government. The BAI agents could operate in their state. You are committed as governor to protecting them. If, in the sole discretion of the chief of the Bureau of Animal Industry, you're not living up to your obligations, the letter specified, we don't need to come back and ask, we can send in federal marshals. And what you have are BAI agents roaming around quarantine areas within states, arresting people, entering property without warrants. These are areas that were specified as quarantine, burning down barns, compensation to be determined. It was something that you just couldn't wait around on and let this, if you went and had a court case on every case, the diseases would have spread. 34 governors signed. Why? The federal government had the power to quarantine whole states at the borders. If you don't sign, the threat was there that, if you don't want Cook County quarantine, we'll quarantine Illinois. That was it. Furthermore, if you weren't working with the federal government, most other states in the country would quarantine your products. And the states had the power to quarantine and protect public health. Next disease, foot and mouth disease. You all remember what happened in England or the United Kingdom in 2001. 6-7 million animals were slaughtered to wipe it out. We had 10 outbreaks, at least, of foot and mouth disease. The key point was in every one of these there was learning, we need to cooperate better, here's a prototypical contract that we can have with the state, so forth and so on. But get this, the worst outbreak was in 1914-16. 22 states, the District of Columbia, and Washington, D.C. were infected. Illinois and Indiana represented about the size of the United Kingdom on this map. The next, so these are huge interventions, nationwide interventions, police power, trenches filled with dead animals, etc. This is not, this is not like Interstate Commerce Commission regulation. Texas fever quarantine. This quarantine line, something very close to it, was established in 1891. A lot of historians know about this. What they don't know about is at the same time, around the turn of the century, 3/5 of the United States was under strict quarantine for 2 scab diseases. So add the Texas fever quarantine, 3/4 or more of the United States was under quarantine. This wasn't some paper thing that didn't matter. You couldn't ship your cattle or sheep out. You had to get permission. You had to show that they had been dipped. They could only go for slaughter. They couldn't go for breeding. The railroads had to prove that they were disinfecting their cars. You had to have separate cars, separate watering holes. Again, these forms of regulations were far more detailed and intrusive than anything the ICC did. Okay, the largest intervention was the Bovine tuberculosis campaign. They tested 232 million cattle, slaughtered 4 million about. They eliminated this disease in a sense by 1941. With pasteurization, this saved hundreds of thousands of U.S. lives by World War II. And in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, they didn't do much of anything until after World War II, again at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. The annual benefits were at least 12 to 1 in the agricultural sector. This shows, again, the kinds of controversies associated with this. Martial law was declared in Iowa, in Iowa. It was a big and long slug. Okay, on the rule of law, just to get some things on the table for maybe later discussion, the BAI forged cooperative agreements. Eventually, most states wanted these agreements, and they were important for being able to move fast when something happened. They killed animals and imposed other costs without full compensation. Was this a taking? The first impression would be, but under the common law and probably most state laws, you can destroy a nuisance without compensation. So in fact, to offer compensation was illegal in many cases. Now, what if the animals are sick? Sure, that applies. But what if they're just exposed or might be sick? So there's a lot of controversy going on here that has to be worked out. But compensation, you're essentially compensating people for them stopping distributing a public nuisance. That was considered a gift of public funds and illegal. It took constitutional changes in some states to allow this to happen, but without it, you couldn't get the farmer cooperation. And without that, it just wouldn't work. Legal interpretations changed with new science, as well they should have. So there's a famous quote or case that Justice Field wrote the decision on, Stephen Field, that the BAI research shows this, I believe it, and the state law is legal. Torts just didn't work. It's ex post, and while you're waiting around to have a case over a couple of years, the disease spreads, the contagion spread, there wouldn't be deep enough pockets, and it would be difficult to prove. Regulation was cheaper and more efficient. When I say there wouldn't have been deep enough pockets, how do you compensate someone for this? I don't know why the Library of Congress is there. But when I say there were 200, they saved hundreds of thousands of lives, this is what the kind of thing people were dying of. And, it was tuberculosis of the skin, the brain, organs, and things of this sort. So this leads us to rethink zero time. Okay, I'll cut it off. Huh? Take a minute. There's just a lot in here that I think is going to be shocking when you read the regular political science or law literature, say on federal administrative capacity. This is far exceeds what people thought was possible. It has a big impact on the rise of the public health movement in the United States. As I noted, a tremendous impact on the organized biological research in the United States. There was a legal dynamic in which the agency's own research and their success in the field affected both Congress and the courts in what I think was a positive way. A big issue is when we had these debates and votes, was it ideology or public interest? And this comes up in the discussions of the ICC and so forth. Well, we can look at a number of related activities or laws that were debated and passed, and in which you could say anyone that was ideologically opposed to the BAI should have been voting one way or the other on this. And those Texans, for the most part, were flopping back and forth. They would be pure, strict constructionists on one thing. But when, for example, foot and mouth disease hit Texas in 1924, within a day or two, the governor of Texas signs over his entire police force, including the Texas Rangers, the federal control. So these ideological concerns disappear at the speed of light in the face of foot and mouth disease and some other diseases. On all the things we could test, huge cost-benefit ratios, blah, 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 and I'll cut it off there.
I wish we had twice as much time for each of these presentations. But exactly, and the paper, which you can get. I should have announced from the beginning, although we didn't distribute hard copies of the papers. They're all available, as you can see on the agenda. You can get all of them. They're on our website. Next, Harold Furchtgott-Roth is going to explain to us how we're going to make telecommunications great again.
It's a great honor to be on this panel with John and Alan. I think a lot of their analysis of whether it's canals in Indiana or the BAI, if we had that intellectual firepower looking at the FCC, I think they could tell a similar story today. I also do want to note the absence of Alan Meltzer. Every time I would see him over the past many years, he would always ask me, what's the latest from the FCC? And I knew exactly what he meant. He wanted to know what's the latest egregious example of something operating outside of the rule of law. He was fascinated by that, and I had no shortage of anecdotes to share with him. I recently was at a 3-day academic philosophy conference, and it's my first time at a philosophy conference. It was quite extraordinary. There were dozens of academics who presented papers. And you know what? At a philosophy conference, the way you present a paper is you read it verbatim, word for word, front to end. I promise you I am not going to do that. But it was quite something, because I think in philosophy every single word matters and the precise sequence of words matters, whereas in economics, well, the words kind of come and go. It doesn't really make that much difference. And in law, who knows? I'm going to talk about the Federal Communications Commission, which is a modern-day example of both some of the examples that John was describing and Alan was describing but this continues on today. President Trump won the election. He was going to make America great again. He promised to roll back regulation, including the FCC. We have a new chairman of the FCC who is very deregulatory. And at the outset, I want to be absolutely clear. When I began writing this paper, in fact, when I wrote most of this paper, I could not have imagined such a great chairman as we have today. And so he's actually doing a lot of the things that I recommend in the paper. But even with the greatest chairman possible at the FCC, what I think the observation I would have is the administrative state, the agency, will survive longer than individuals. That the FCC, independent agencies in particular, from the reform movement of the late 19th century, were set up to establish agencies that were about individuals. They were not about the rule of law. They were about that there were these individuals who were elites, as John described them. They were set up because there were these new technologies, new areas that were beyond the comprehension of ordinary legislators from places such as where I grew up in Tennessee and South Carolina. So you put these great individuals in charge of these agencies and you tell them to go off and do great things and don't really worry about what the law says. That's how these agencies were set up, whether it was the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887, the Federal Radio Commission in 1926, or the Federal Communications Commission in 1934. And frankly, to this day, that is still how they operate. And that causes a lot of problems. It causes the problems that John described of politics influencing economics and then the route backwards. It's very different. Legislators trying to influence scores of legislators is a lot more difficult than trying to influence a handful of individuals. And frankly, some agencies that have a single head, all you have to do is influence one person. Or in the case of an independent agency, you have to influence three people. Very different than trying to influence an entire legislature. The net result is, as we've seen here in Washington in 2017 and in many years past, legislatures have a very difficult time doing much of anything. It's very difficult to write new laws, to respond to changes. Agencies that are headed up by individuals or by small groups of individuals can and do respond very quickly. That may be good for quick policy response. It may actually be very bad for democracy and for the rule of law when those individuals do not feel in any particular way tethered to any particular law. In my paper, I explained that we have not reached the end of regulation. FCC regulation is not about to end. We have not reached a Francis Fukuyama moment of the end of regulation. Indeed, it's going to come back. And ultimately, it's going to come back because regulation is ultimately about discretion, and the FCC is not about to end it. Congress is not poised to end the FCC. The courts abet the power of the FCC, and it's going to take a combination of actions by the FCC, Congress, and the courts to reduce regulation at the FCC. I think none of those is particularly likely to happen. The most likely is actually what we're seeing at the Commission right now, where Chairman Pai is taking specific actions to both rationalize regulation and to reduce regulation. But this is not the end of regulation by any stretch. The FCC is a microcosm of regulation throughout the federal government, and the failure to end regulation at the FCC, I think, is a sobering reminder of the challenges that people have who want to do broader deregulation throughout the economy. In the paper, I describe how to be an agency head has been, since the progressive movement, to be heroic, to be beyond just an ordinary person. And in fact, that is exactly the way that the agencies have been run. And it's the indoctrination that one gets to become a commissioner, but particularly a chairman of a federal agency. It's literally people would pull me aside and sort of say, don't worry about what the law says, just go off and do what's right. I think if one is resistant to that view of the world, you can be in a very lonely place, and that's exactly what people told me. If you think the laws actually matter, then that's not the way these organizations operate. The result is exactly what John described happened in Indiana, which is about the distinction between venal corruption and systematic corruption. The corruption that goes on at federal agencies is very much the latter and not the former. It's not that individuals are becoming wealthy. It's not that there are people taking money or bribes. I've never really seen that or heard of that happening. But what does happen is this sense of decisions being made outside of any kind of legal framework, and everyone kind of going along with that, including, unfortunately, the courts. And I'll discuss that in a bit more detail in a few minutes. Why is the FCC important? Well, I would say it punches way outside of its weight. It's, in the scheme of Washington, it's a tiny agency. It has a budget of $506 million for FY16, 1,650 full-time staff. That's by Washington standards. That's a very small place. And yet, if you read any daily newspaper or look online, you're going to see lots and lots of references to the FCC. This morning's Wall Street Journal has a couple of articles on the FCC. You won't find that as frequently, say, about Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. You won't find it about the Department of Agriculture. How many times does it show up on the Wall Street Journal? Even though in terms of size and employees and budget, it's probably 100 times bigger than the FCC. One of the reasons that, and in terms of the economy, while people like to say it's really important, it regulates at most about $1 trillion out of a $18 trillion economy. It's 6%. It's still a lot, but it's not as much as, say, the energy sector. It's not as much as banking sector, which, again, probably doesn't show up as much on a relative basis as does the FCC. I focus on the FCC not just because it has enormous discretion, but it has enormous discretion that touches the daily lives of individuals, whether it's regulating the media or newspapers or the internet. And it's an agency that is filled with popular personalities. People, whether it was Bill Gates or Steve Jobs when he was alive, Ted Turner, Sumner Redstone, John Malone, Barry Diller, Eric Schmidt, Jeff Bezos, Tim Cook, Mark Zuckerberg, movie stars, television personalities, they have all at some point in time either marched through the halls of the FCC or been visited by people from the FCC, all with the particular purpose of ingratiating themselves, because this, again, it's an agency that exercises extraordinary discretion, and it's not just about what does the narrow rule of law have to say. Well, you might say, well, there is a law. There is the Communications Act. Yes, this is all true. And the Commission is obliged to write regulations under the Communications Act and under the APA. And it does that up to a point. And it does that also in ways that sometimes go beyond what the law says. If you look at the history of appeals to the courts of FCC rules, there's an extraordinary pattern of judicial deference to FCC decisions going all the way back to the initial decisions back in the 1930s. Part of that is I think the courts have recognized that if they told the Commission that they had exceeded the laws, that the agency might literally collapse. Some of the early decisions in the 1930s on broadcast regulations that the Commission promulgated that were challenged as being outside of the statutory authority, and they clearly were way outside of the statutory authority. And this, in a series of court cases that led up to the 1943 decision of NBC versus the Federal Communications Commission, where the Commission had written rules about regulating networks, broadcast networks, even though there's absolutely nothing in the statute about the Commission's authority to regulate broadcast networks. And an opinion written by Felix Frankfurter said that, the Commission has these extraordinary powers, and it's really important for the Commission to do the good things that it does. Ever since then, there have been many other challenges to commission authority, and the courts have typically deferred to them. This has been put into the particular category of Chevron deference in the past 40 years, but long before Chevron, the courts have had a pattern of simply telling the commission, you can pretty much do what you want to do. There are various causes for the commission to operate outside of the law, one of which is the law itself is fixed in time. It's originally written in 1934. Technology had changed between 1934 and the next major rewrite, which was 1996. Technology has again changed dramatically between 1996 and the present time. And so when you're trying to regulate technology in a way and you have a body of law that is somehow inherently going to be dated, there's a tendency for the courts to want to give the agency a little bit of discretion. The other problem is the combination of powers that the commission has. And I wrote a book at AEI about this called A Tough Act to Follow, that very much focused on the problems of an independent regulatory agency that combines all the powers of government into one body. And third is the Congress not only allows the commission to engage in extra legal activities, if you will, it frankly encourages them because it's a crutch for Congress to be able to get things done for constituents by having an independent agency that doesn't rely on Congress actually passing the law to get things done. And so Congress can tell their constituents, we're going to get something done for you, but it's not going to be through the legislative process. It's going to be through this other agency that Congress has some influence on. Which all brings us back to the question of the administrative state that has been quite popular in the past couple of years. And will the administrative state shape the commission, or will a vibrant, young, energetic FCC chairman tame the administrative state? Who's going to be there longer, the bureaucracy or the chairman? And who's going to have the greater legacy? I say all of this with, frankly, extraordinary fondness, respect, admiration for the commission. It does a lot of great things. My concern is a lot of times the great things it does are somehow outside of the law, and I just find that very difficult to quietly accept. Well, what might a great chairman do? And I wrote these ideas months before Chairman Pai became chairman, but let me just read them to you. Have a vision, have fealty to the statute, understand the power of Chevron deference and its limitations, articulate the concepts of necessity and consistency with the public interest in new regulations. The Communications Act is larded with the phrases in the public interest and whether it's necessary in the public interest, and the commission has kind of used this as an elastic idea, and it could also be used to limit government intervention. Review existing rules completely as required by law, avoid merger reviews entirely, discern the costs and benefits of regulation, articulate property rights concepts whenever possible, have a strategy of winning at litigation based on the statute, not based on just Chevron deference, and slow the re-regulation process going forward. I would say, by the way, I think Chairman Pai has done the vast majority of these, and it's really quite extraordinary. The administrative state still is going to be around long after Chairman Pai leaves office. What are some of the challenges for Congress? And none of these is going to happen, and there's frankly no prospect of them. Pass legislation to separate the FCC into different organizations based on dividing them up among rulemaking enforcement and adjudication, update the Communications Act, articulate property rights and contract rights, pass authorization bills for the Commission. The last one was in 1991. Bring the FCC into the appropriations process. That has not happened for a very long time because the Commission raises all of its funds through fees that bypass the appropriations process. Congress could clarify that Chevron is a usurpation of congressional prerogatives. I could go on. None of these is going to happen. Challenges for the courts. I think first and foremost is to cabin Chevron deference. This is not what Justice Scalia intended it to be, what it has come to be, which is, I think, a way for judges, frankly, to look at complex government decisions and just turn a blind eye and sort of say, it's Chevron deference, I'm out of here. The issues are far too important, and it simply has become a vehicle for federal agencies to test the boundaries of law and go well beyond the boundaries of law, and the courts just will let them do whatever they want to do. So in conclusion, is the administrative state concerned about the election of Donald Trump? I think the simple answer is no. That some people will say that doesn't matter as long as the public believes the system is working well, and it works. It continues to work regardless of who is in charge, but I think it continues to work in a way that is outside of the rule of law. And if Alan Meltzer were here, I would be able to regale him with yet more stories about the FCC.
Thanks so much, Harold, and thanks to all three of the authors for exerting a lot of self-discipline in keeping to the more or less to the time frame. And I'm going to mirror that self-discipline by not bringing up my own questions and comments first. Instead, I'm going to open the floor. We have about 20 minutes, and what I'm going to do is take a couple of comments, maybe as many as 3 comments and questions. And as some of you know, we've been working as a working group too. We have a pre-conference before this, and so we've had formal discussants. And so I'm going to give some preference to some of those people who've been participating in this all along to help prioritize for us a little bit of our comments. But I promise we'll find time for as many as we can. But we'll start with Jennifer. If you could, I'll collect 3 comments, and then we'll address those quickly, and then we'll go collect 3 more. Jennifer?
Those were all very interesting papers. I have a question comment mostly for Harold and Alan, which really goes to, in your view, what does it mean to bring an agency that has expertise and therefore must have discretion into the rule of law? And then the comment that precedes the question. So when I was originally asked to participate in this project, Alan Meltzer clearly was framing it within this idea that we have separation of power, legislatures do rules, and agencies are executives, and agencies aren't supposed to be doing a lot of things that look like rules and law. And Harold, when I listen to you, you keep saying extra legal, but I don't know exactly what you mean by that. Is it that the agency's exercising a lot of discretion, or is it an explicit statutory limitation? It's going beyond, or do you just don't like how much discretion Congress gave it? I mean, what does it mean for something to go outside the rule of law? And Alan's paper is the perfect bookend to yours, because here's an agency that was given an area, diseases of animals, cows mostly, I think, and told if it is a disease, if it's in your category, you get to decide if it's contagious or not. And then you get to decide if quarantine is needed, and you get police power, and we're not going to have courts first, action second, and the governors are going to sign things over, but once they do, you're off to the races. I mean, enormous discretion, and it was clearly a really good idea. So in looking at your paper, what brings it outside the rule of law? And I go back to Kenneth Culp Davis's work and Rabin's work, looking at how does the rule of law, how should it operate in an administrative state where you need discretion. And they both reject the idea that separation of powers and only legislatures make laws. No, legislatures have to give administrative agencies power to make rules that really operate an awful lot like laws, as you were talking about. And then we have to think deeply about what that means. I tried to, in my paper, is to say, well, then what do you need to do to cabin discretion? I have a 2x2 matrix, which I'm fond of. If I can put it in 2x2 matrix, I'm happy. Actually, it's 3x3. But so I'd like to push back a little on you, or at least find out what exactly, it can't be deregulation. I keep hearing you conflating rule of law and deregulation. There's nothing in the rule of law that leads you to necessarily deregulation per se. See our animals. We kind of want that. So, what do each of you think the rule of law means for an agency that must have discretion over something that's really a public good, which both animal contagion and our broadcast rights, our privacy, the internet, that's really a public good?
Okay, and the third question before we let the authors answer briefly, Chris Demuth.
I'd like to comment on all these issues, but I'm going to
Press the button.
I'm going to help Harold answer Jen's question.
You're going to get it whether you like it or not.
I think a secret to the FCC's power is not just that it regulates something that is ubiquitous and in many respects glamorous and famous and, that movie stars and all that kind of thing, but that it regulates the electromagnetic spectrum, which is this kind of abstract thing, but that degree of power no other agency possesses. Americans may not communicate with one another through wireless means without the permission of people. If this doesn't have the proper certification, I'm committing a crime right now. Right?
You're committing a crime.
I'm committing a crime. That's an enormous amount of power, and it bootstraps into a lot of things that. Well, you said you couldn't think of outright corruption, people coming in with grocery bags full of money. I think that there's a lot at the FCC, including things that you've seen not in your own office but in other people's offices, that come pretty close, and that Jennifer would acknowledge. Two companies cannot merge without having their licenses adjusted to use the spectrum, and it uses that to have this non-antitrust power over mergers. If you want a merger of your company and you go into the FCC, I know of cases where you are told you have to finance a city park in a congressman's district. Is this not corruption? And then you have to agree to do a lot of favors for the FCC, and to specify that and put it in writing that you will agree to their authority over this and the other aspects of your business. Those seem to me, this kind of thing is well known to people about the FCC. Another agency, the FDA, with great power and long-term relationships with regulated parties. They do a lot of good at the FDA. There's an enormous amount of corruption that goes unreported. So I think that there's a great deal. If I plead with you in the final version of your paper, in your recommendations for the FCC, that they adopt the Harold Furchtgott-Roth electromagnetic spectrum dezoning proposal, which you have propounded with great persuasiveness, and would defang the FCC in a lot of areas where what it does is pretty unambiguously bad and shading over into corruption.
before I let the authors address it very briefly, and then we'll have another set of questions, I just do want to advertise a little bit for our group, that our group sort of is presenting two different sets of papers over the last several years that we've been operating. Some of the papers are fact papers, and some of the papers are how to make the structure better papers. I'd say Harold is a little bit of both. The prior two are mainly the fact side, but we do have a lot of good proposals about reforms that I just want to mention. Jennifer alluded to some. Mike has a paper. Lon Werman has a paper. Will Baud has a paper. So we do have a conversation going on that I think is relevant to some of this discussion, which we haven't really managed to reconnect. So I encourage Ilan and Will to get involved, especially in this, and Mike. But let's let the authors respond briefly.
First of all, Jennifer and Chris, thank you very much for your comments. Briefly, deregulation is the law. It is in the preamble to the 96 Act. It is in Section 10 of the Act. It is in Section 11 of the Act. It is Section 202 of the Act. It is throughout the Act. I was a staffer working on the drafting of the statute. Deregulation is the statutory basis for the Commission. Second, the Commission, while I was a commissioner for 3 years, I wrote not one, not two, but scores of dissents about the Commission operating outside of the statute. Chairman Pai, when he was a commissioner, wrote probably scores of dissents about the Commission operating outside of the statute. The Commission operating outside of the statute is not an isolated event. It happens, not everything. I think I dissented only probably from 15% of the rules that were before the Commission at the time. But it happens with some regularity. John talked about bad outcomes and really bad outcomes. Let me tell you some really bad outcomes that have happened at within the Commission, and a lot of these have to do with expropriation. Expropriation before the Communications Act. Tom Hazlett has written extensively about this. The expropriation of spectrum by the 1926 Act. That was Congress expropriating, actually. But then more recently, if you look at, this probably fall in the category of bad outcomes. The first application to the Commission for cellular license technology was around 1950. It took roughly 30 years for the Commission to ultimately approve the technology. The calculation of the lost consumer surplus to the American consumer from the delay in getting wireless services out to the American public is astronomical. The numbers I've seen have all been way too small. The 2000 stock market bubble, the internet bubble, and I've written extensively about this, I think was in large part the result of confused and unlawful rules at the Commission that led to confusion in the market about what the actual laws were. Different investment groups invested in different concepts. There was a lot of economic dislocation as a result of the Commission not having acted clearly inside of the rule of law. I could go on, but I won't, because Charlie's told me to stop.
Not to stop.
Okay.
You know.
Jennifer raised a really important point that I alluded to, and that's that in the early years, at least, the BAI had expertise that basically no one else had. So it'd be analogous to, say, the FBI having crime-fighting techniques or bomb detection techniques or something like that maybe the state of Wyoming wouldn't have, but in this case, no state had. And when you get a tragic event, you want the FBI to come in and take over. So maybe the local sheriff who hates the county sheriff or whatever, you can get above these kinds of squabbles. There were, as I was listening to Harold, I came across some cases where you could say there was favoritism, but in general, they were trying to and I think succeeding most often in exercising their powers fairly evenly and fairly across the board, which seems, given the enormous prospects for rent seeking, it seems hard to believe. But we were looking, we were consciously looking for this kind of stuff in the papers and acquisitions and in private letters. It just didn't come up much. I would say also that there were several times when the courts reined them in on important issues, very important issues. And generally within a year or so, Congress extended the powers. So the courts held it to the technicality, and Congress said, well, we now think they should be able to do that. So I should also say that this, when they went in and started a disease program, it was generally not just arbitrarily entering an area and starting it. That would be true with foot and mouth disease. That's probably the most contagious or most infectious virus known to mankind. I mean, it's blown in from hundreds of miles away in the countries, airborne. But in a lot of these, most of these other ones, they went in, they held town hall meetings, they held plebiscites, they held education programs. There would be votes, often with supermajorities required. And then when they got those votes, then it was dictatorial in that everyone had to participate. But given that you're dealing with contagions, this is the kind of situation where you, even as a firm believer in the rule of law and allowing individual exceptions, you probably don't want to allow exceptions. I mean, one focal point of a disease can allow it to spread. There were other times when Congress debated reining them in, and I think actually did, when they went in the pharmaceutical business. And this is at an early time in the business. Private industry wasn't doing much. There were big concerns over contamination in private industry products. And the most important of these that I remember, it turns out the private industry was, that their stuff was junk because the BAI had come up with the wrong theory of what a particular disease was. And so what they were producing was just junk. And they wanted the BAI to stop all research on that. Well, subsequent research showed that something called hog cholera wasn't a bacterium, it was a virus. And so so these are the kinds of self-interest debates that went on in Congress after the fact.
As you can tell, we designed this to have tension, this discussion, because the point is that there are some really valuable things that are produced, even by some of the processes that are the most troubling, that employ discretion and unaccountable experts or reduce the accountability of experts. And so that was exactly the tension that I wanted to bring out in these papers. Ilan, we're going to take quick one. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I forgot that.
Yeah, it's okay. So I've been working on this for a long time. So I have a paper in the Journal of Economic History in 2005 called Constitutions, Corporations, and Corruption, which lays out a sort of a political economy, public finance reason for why the states adopted general laws. I have a paper in a volume called Corruption Reform, edited by Claudia Golden and Ed Glazer, on the concept of systematic corruption in American history, which is about the intellectual history of how people feared that politics was manipulating economics and how that came about. I would say, though, and this paper went from 50 pages to 60 pages, it was getting too much longer, is that one of the points I'm trying to make is you can tell really, really coherent explanations for why people did what they did, and you can test it, you can identify if you want, you can do all the stuff you want to do. That doesn't mean that what they wanted to do is what happened. Okay? So it isn't that they wanted to eliminate systematic corruption. By eliminating, things got better. They had particular local sets of interests that drove their decisions. And so that's why in this version I talked about the conceptual framework, because really we need to have a bigger picture that's not about intentions and outcomes, but just about dynamics, about how the pieces fit together. And if we don't have a good picture about how the pieces that fit together, then we don't understand why the legislators want to do X, and Y is the outcome. We like Y, but we need to understand that the outcome of general laws, the eliminating the really bad outcomes, is something that's the result of the dynamics of how the system fits together rather than the intentionality. So I think I try to provide intentional explanations in these other papers, and here I'm trying to explain what are more the general pattern.
Ilan, we have a microphone. Could we get one? Thank you. Then
So I wanted to follow up on Jennifer's question and also to praise, Alan, your book. I really like the example of the BAI because I think it helps us to see that we've been thinking about administrative power kind of wrong for many, many years, and delegation of power kind of in the wrong way also for many years, because the BAI did have tremendous discretion. You see like swarms of federal officials going in, destroying private property, quarantining 3/4 of the United States. This is a tremendous exercise of administrative power and administrative discretion. But discretion over what? And that's what's never asked. Their discretion to do different kinds of things. So when you look at the BAI and the examples that everyone talks about are the quarantining, the taking and destroying property, and compensating for that. The BAI could not and did not do any of those things until Congress explicitly gave it the authorization to do it. And it tried. And it had to ask governors, can you let us come in and do this? And some said yes, some said no. But imagine that happening today. Today, you just pass a broad statute saying, stop contagious diseases, public interest, intelligible principle. And you could pass a regulation saying, we're going to quarantine. We're going to take private property. We're going to compensate it at X amount. And all of that would probably pass muster under modern doctrine of administrative and constitutional law. But the BAI example, the way it was done, to me, vindicates constitutional processes. It shows that these huge problems could be solved if only you wait for Congress and the president to pass a piece of legislation, and then you actually give bureaucrats discretion to do what they're supposed to do, which is decide where you should put the quarantine because that's a purely scientific question. But whether there should be a quarantine, whether you can take and destroy private property, how much to compensate, those are the legislative and policy questions that the BAI never had a handle in until Congress told them.
we only have 3 minutes left.
Sorry about that.
So that's all right. So I'm going to take two more quick comments from Michael and one other person. Actually, I'm going to choose you. I'm sorry in the back, but we're going to go for it. Mike?
I had a question for John Wallace. I fully understand how the movement to generally applicable laws is an antidote to systemic corruption. But I'm curious because I don't know how it would work in the context of a couple of your examples. So general incorporation laws fully get you, and it makes great sense. But when it comes to, say, banking licensure, surely I'm curious to know, did we have general banking incorporation where anybody could come together and call themselves a bank? That seems highly implausible.
It's called free banking.
Anybody can. So
you have to meet certain requirements.
And the other example you were using is canals. I assume that not everybody can build a canal. And so I'm just wondering, if there are industries in which general incorporation doesn't work, what was the solution, the post-Civil War solution to how to decide who could do it?
That's the second comment.
Thank you. The general comment is that what I've been hearing in the discussion about rule of law is about the relationship between generality on the one hand and specificity on the other. As Jennifer said, there are statutes that say regulate in the public interest. So very hard to say agencies not complying with law. Maybe the question is how specific and how general. Second is a more specific question, if there's time, for Alan. If you have a theory of what is the political economy by which the scholarly community failed to notice this agency.
Mike's question is a really good one. With banks, they established a procedure for establishing a bank. It's called free banking. It's not called general law, but they are general laws. which then became the law for the National Banking Act in the Civil War, which established criteria. And the key here is that the criteria are impersonal, they're administrative, and there's no legislative involvement in the process. That was the key. For typically, some states banned special incorporation, a special charter for unique. They all had to be the same. That meant if your special charter, for example, had a capitalization limit, and you wanted to charter a railroad, and the railroad needed more capital than the general act, then you couldn't have the railroad. So they would often say, in that case, you can write a special act. And what they did in the 1880s with New Jersey and then Delaware was they expanded the general laws to broaden the limits within which a corporation could be formed, so that those tight constraints that were put on in the 1840s were loosened. So a corporation was able to determine its own capitalization, and then that solved. So some of the special problems were taken care of sequentially over the next century.
Alan? You're talking to the microphone.
The legislation often said such things as to eradicate or control contagious pleural pneumonia and any other or all other contagious infectious and communicable diseases, or these open-ended statements in the legislation. The legislation would say things like, as deemed necessary, and so forth. So open-ended, and these were not accidents. They were debated. The opponents explicitly said, how can you say as deemed necessary? That gives this man the power to shut down the animal trade of the nation and to confiscate my property. So the kinds of concerns that most of you would raise were debated, and Congress went ahead on a lot of these things. In terms of your theory, my theory is it just took someone extremely hardworking and brilliant
To identify the right person to speak to you today.
I have no idea.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, though. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists and thank all of you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. Let's take a break, and we reconvene at 10:45, which is about 10 minutes from now.
We're getting started about 5 minutes late, but we'll live with that. Maybe we'll take it out of lunch. So this panel, so what's the difference between this panel and the former as an organizing principle? I think this is mostly the law people, and we were hearing mostly from the econ people before, but I think in terms of subject matter, it's sometimes a little hard to tell the difference. We're going to be hearing 3 papers. One of them of a primarily historical bent. That'll be Aditya Bamzai's paper about the development of the doctrines of deference in the 30s and 40s. We're going to be hearing from Chris Walker from Ohio State University on the subject of some very promising reforms to the Administrative Procedure Act, which have I think the words consensual, broad-based, bipartisan appear. Oh, and common sense. I forgot and common sense appear in the paper. Maybe it's like Homer's wine dark sea. But we can. He'll be telling us about that, and then then Vicki Jackson from Harvard is going to be talking about red and blue state federalism. Now, how does that fit? When we put this together, at least, what Charles and I were thinking is that with the new administration, that there is renewed interest in structural principles of lawmaking of 2 dimensions. One is separation of powers between the branches. Suddenly it becomes really important to people who didn't seem to think it was important the day before yesterday, how much power the president has, and that has revitalized and given more energy to questions that many of us have been concerned about for some time, but also questions of a division of power at the levels of federal, state, and local. And so Vicki is our sole representative of that second range of questions, but it doesn't make them any less important. So let's just proceed in the order in which the program indicates. So we're going to begin with Vicki, then move to Aditya, and then Chris.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to reflect on federalism in this time. In early discussions, I was being asked to think about blue state federalism, and I thought, well, actually, I want to do red state and blue state, which is the title. The paper has both a doctrinal component and a very non-doctrinal component, thinking about the possibilities of federalism in addressing a range of ills. I may not get to say anything about the latter given the time constraints, but happy to discuss in questions if people want to talk about it. So I was writing another paper at the time I was asked to think about this that spends a lot of time looking at the thinking of Louis Brandeis, who was a famous progressive, probably the first national level public interest lawyer. He was a fan of regulation. He thought regulation was very important to protect against various ills that had developed. And he was a fan of the states having a lot of authority to experiment. He is the author of the famous phrase about the states being laboratories of experimentation. Now, as a result of the association of states' rights with the racial caste system, segregation, and the odiousness of that, I think Brandeis's emphasis on the virtues of decision-making at smaller levels of government gets lost for a time in the 20th century. And in scholarship on federalism, understandably, given the odiousness of what was being done under the banner of states' rights. The paper suggests a perspective that I think hasn't appeared much in the literature on federalism yet, and in the end may not change how we think about it, but struck me as interesting, so let me tell you what I was thinking. In the 1960s and 70s, I argue, there were a couple of significant structural changes affecting what we might think of as the relative democratic legitimacy of the federal government as compared to the state governments. So if you look at the federal and state governments, say in the late 1950s, what do we see? Well, the federal government, the Congress, under the Constitution, has the House allocated more or less by population, and it has the Senate allocated according to the constitutional requirement of equal suffrage. Each state has 2 senators. Each senator has 1 vote, clearly required in the Constitution, and thus clearly supported by what I would call rule of law legitimacy. Written down. Rules are written down. But that allocation represents a certain degree of malapportionment in the national legislative process vis-a-vis population. The state legislatures at this time, or many of the state legislatures, are also malapportioned. Many, though not all of the states, have bicameral legislatures with upper houses apportioned in ways that correspond largely to history. And in some states, at least, state constitutional requirements for taking a state census and for reapportioning the lower house were ignored. So a famous case comes up to the Supreme Court involving Tennessee, which had last done a reapportionment in 1900. Well, what happens between 1900 and 1960? There's mass movement of the population from rural areas into the cities. This is happening all over the United States. As a consequence, the districts represented in the state legislature become very malapportioned. The rural voters' votes count a heck of a lot more than the city. Rural voters' votes count more than the city voters' votes because the state isn't reapportioning. And what happens in the 1960s are 2 important things, I think. One is in a line of cases, the first one was Baker and Carr, which came out of Tennessee, and then there were a number of others. The Supreme Court held that there is an important constitutional principle, and here I'm reminded of John Wallace's emphasis on the dynamism of our understanding of what our law requires. An important principle, I'm quoting now from a case called Reynolds and Sims on page 4 of the paper, full and effective participation by all citizens in state government requires that each citizen have an equally effective voice in the election of members of his state legislature. Modern and viable state government needs, and the Constitution demands no less. Now, this may not have been the understanding at the founding. What changed? Well, we have the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. We have the 15th Amendment saying no discrimination on voting based on race. We have the 19th Amendment, no discrimination in voting based on gender. We've got the poll tax amendment. We've got the 18-year-old voting amendment. Voting and equality assume much larger roles in the Constitution over time, in part through the formal amendment process, in part through judicial interpretation. All right, so that's one important development in the 1960s. And unlike some of the Supreme Court's other decisions that called for significant changes, there was massive compliance with the reapportionment decisions. Yes, there was some litigation, but the scholars writing in the 60s and early 70s said, wow, state legislatures were really getting on board with this. The second thing that happened in the 1960s was that Congress addressed the fact that in a number of our states, large percentages of the population who were totally disenfranchised by virtue of their race. And the Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which not alone, but with enforcement efforts over the next decade or two, resulted in the enfranchisement of significant parts of the population that had been disenfranchised in some of the states. So my suggestion is, wow, if you take a look at the relative democratic legitimacy of the state governments and the federal governments, according to the one criterion, and I'm going to get to some caveats in a minute, the one criterion of is it one person, one vote? And are most adults enfranchised? The state lawmaking processes look a little bit more maybe democratically legitimate than that of our national government. There's another component I haven't mentioned, which is that the allocation of the Senate affects also the allocation of votes in the Electoral College. And so we have a national lawmaking process involving the two houses of Congress and the president, but presidential elections are population-wise skewed by the allocation of votes in the Senate. And as all of us know, I'm sure, in the last 5 presidential elections, in 2 of them, the person who won the most popular votes did not win the Electoral College. In the states, by contrast, I think, at least as far as I know, all of the states have governors now who are directly elected. Again, that was not true at the founding, and I don't know the whole history. I know these 2 points. So, with respect to their constituencies, the state governments, they're one state. The national government, the whole country. The state governments, on the single criterion of one person, one vote, look like they are more representative in terms of democratic legitimacy. Now, it is true, this has been suggested, well, the Congress has always been malapportioned. Absolutely right. And as I said, rule of law legitimacy, absolutely. Constitution is completely clear to senators, and that's highly entrenched in the Constitution. But it might be relevant to say that at the founding, as far as I could tell, and I'm happy to be corrected, looking at the population of the largest state, which I believe was Virginia, and the smallest state, which I believe was Delaware, the ratio of total population in Virginia to total population in Delaware was 13-1. And the 1790 census has a category called free white men over the age of 16. If you look at those figures and compare those 2 states, the ratio is 10-1. Fast forward to today, 2016, the census estimates that the state of California has 39.25 million persons, and the state of Wyoming has 585,500. And I think that ratio is something like 66 or 67 to 1. So the malapportionment has grown over time, and yet our Constitution and our Supreme Court's case law have, over time, placed increasing weight on equality in voting. Okay. Some caveats now, and time-wise, how am I doing?
You've got 10 more minutes.
Okay, great, thank you. So, okay, here are some caveats that I think are important. I want to say that democracy in all its forms is actually only one of a number of values that you want a constitution to promote, a very important one. But what else might you want? Rule of law, I've already mentioned. It's another important value of particular concern to this conference. Rights, the protection of rights against what may be democratic majority decisions, also important. What else? Constitutions should be and are set up typically to promote social and economic welfare, to allow efficiency in operation, and to allow appropriate expertises to participate in decision making. So democracy, I want to say, is just one value, albeit a very important one. The second thing I want to say is that in terms of democracy as a value, the one person, one vote idea, I think, is a very important way of getting at it, but it's not the only way. If you look at the literature on representation, you might think of representation not in terms of individuals, but in terms of groups. And indeed, a way of thinking about the Senate is that the Senate was intended to provide for pluralism and for the representation of groups based on state territorial lines. But there are other groups that might be very salient today. And a paper by Baker and Dinkin, which I cite in my piece, took a look at the situation of racial minorities. And they looked at all groups classified as racial minorities in the census of 1990, meaning all groups other than white, non-Hispanic. That group of racial minorities was 24% of the population. 50% of all racial minorities lived in 5 states, which means that they argued, and I think they're right, that the allocation of senators, 2 per each state, might underrepresent the interests of racial minorities, some of whom have been highly disadvantaged in many other ways. But one person, one vote, not the only criterion for judging democracy. You might also care about the deliberative quality of a democracy. You might think of democracy not as a snapshot at one time of what people think, but of over time. So having a body like the Senate with staggered elections might be a good and different approach to democracy. Okay. The last caveat is that I think there's some things that I think we know from work by people more gifted at looking at economic issues than I think I am. There's some things we think we know about the effects of the Senate on legislative outcomes, and that is that the Senate seems to have the effect of distributing disproportionate per capita amounts of federal revenues to the smaller population states in ways that absolutely do not correspond with poverty levels or need or anything. It looks like it's the operation of the Senate. How much else? We don't know. It may not make a huge difference in a lot of cases. It may make a difference in some cases. I think it's an area where more research is needed, and one of my hopes is to provoke that. Let me talk a little bit about implications, and I think I will only have time to talk about implications for doctrine. So, I went through in my paper various areas in which the Supreme Court has, since the early 90s, in important ways modified and developed the constitutional law of federalism-based limitations on national power. So for what am I talking about? The court said a guns near school law was beyond Congress's power because there was no required connection to interstate commerce. The court said a law protecting against gender-motivated violence was beyond both the Commerce Clause power and the powers under the 14th Amendment for various reasons and so forth. But I ended up concluding that it was very hard to think of how my observation about the Senate would impact on the scope of national authority, and here's why. The Constitution gives authorities to the national government, and however imperfectly democratic the Congress may be, it is the most democratic branch that we have at the national level. And lots of things are given to the federal government because the states, acting separately, as we heard from the papers in the first panel, have face problems they actually can't address separately. And especially as the number of states have grown, the challenges of getting all the states to sign on to an agreement become smaller and smaller. So I ended up being unable to think of ways in which doctrine might capture this democratic deficit in analyzing the scope of national power. However, there was one area of federalism doctrine where it struck me that perhaps this observation, if people agree with it and if it holds up and if it isn't counterbalanced by other factors, which many of which I discuss in the paper, might have an impact, and that is in an area where constitutional law and statutory law come together, intersect, and it's an area called preemption. And so Congress enacts a law authorizing the OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, to provide for safe workplaces, and that the agency promulgates regulatory standards. The preemption question is, can states require more than what the federal OSHA requires, or is there lawmaking authority? Ordinarily, states could regulate workplaces within their state. Is their lawmaking authority preempted by virtue of the statute? And this issue arises across every area of federal law, or many, many areas of federal law. And most scholars who've looked at it think the doctrine is in something of a muddle. It seems that the same words get recited about what the tests are, but they seem to be applied in ways that feel inconsistent to people who have studied it. I have suggested in the paper, and I'll end on this, that if we think about the relative democratic legitimacy of state lawmaking processes and Congress, it might provide a basis to have a more consistent presumption that state lawmaking power is not preempted. A presumption that can be overcome, but to have that presumption more consistently applied. Thank you, and happy to talk during questions about my other arguments.
The opportunity to speak today. I'm really honored to be here, honored to be on this law panel with Vicki and Chris. There's a way in which, though I'm extremely honored to be on the law panel, there's a way in which my paper connects to the panel that we had earlier this morning, and the two of the papers there, the historical papers. So I'm thinking of how John Wallace's paper, and hopefully I won't butcher this when I give the 30,000-foot summary of what that paper is about. It challenged us to think about how legislative changes can have consequences for the rule of law. And then Alan Olmsted's paper about how administration through the BAI can have positive welfare effects and at the same time challenge us on our thoughts about rule of law principles. What I'm talking about is how changes in administrative law at the Supreme Court in the 1940s might affect how we think about the rule of law. And one of the challenges of my discussion is that when we're talking about Supreme Court cases and principles of administrative law, we're not talking about concrete agencies, examples, but rather rules that apply in a broad variety of cases to a number of different agencies. And so I don't have great examples about livestock being killed, slaughtered, burned, etc. Although these issues are more abstract, they're no less important. And so what I'm going to discuss are three issues in modern administrative law that are really, in some respects, the central concerns of administrative law. The first is the issue of delegation and who within the United States government should control government action. What's the scope of lawful authority? And the second is the question of powers. What are the powers wielded? What sort of techniques investigative, or rulemaking are available to administrators who are acting within their lawfully delegated authority. And then the third is the question of judicial review of executive action, particularly the standard of review that courts should use when reviewing executive action. And that's really about what sort of avenues are available to those who believe that administrators have acted outside the scope of their lawful authority. And to be sure, there are other important, very, very important topics in administrative law, but these are the three that I'll focus on, in part because they're a good subject for a conference on the rule of law and regulation. After all, if you think of the questions writ large, you'll see the connection. Who should exercise executive authority? How much should they exercise? What can they do with that authority? Where do you go to complain if you think the authority has been abused? These are central problems that any theory of the rule of law should concern itself with. And I'm also focusing on these three issues for another reason, and that is because it's my thesis that these three doctrines underwent subtle but fundamental changes during the decade of the 1940s at the Supreme Court. And that's to say, the Supreme Court enters the 1940s with one perspective on these questions, and then they leave the 1940s with another perspective, and we live with the consequences today. So this is an example. I guess Charlie started us off by thinking about ways in which law can be changed. This is an example of law being changed by the court through jurisprudence over a decade. So why focus on this decade in particular? Here are three reasons. There are others, but first, the immediately prior decade, it's well known that a number of shifts in American law happened during that decade when we have the New Deal, the Roosevelt presidency, and there's a Supreme Court that is believed in the beginning of that decade to be antagonistic to some of the new government initiatives, and it is at least on the conventional narrative to end with the court accommodating a more active government role in the economy. And yet the changes that occur in the next decade, the 1940s, they haven't been subject to the same scrutiny, even though they are in some respects equally important and perhaps less dramatic in that there's not this titanic battle between court and government, but equally important for us today. Second, the changes occur at the same time that Congress is considering a statute to govern administrative law, which is the Administrative Procedure Act, and it's enacted in 1946. So we have broader jurisprudential debates about administrative law that might tell us something about how the legal community and intelligent legal commentators understood the meaning of terms used in the Administrative Procedure Act. We still live with that act today. Those Chris Walker will discuss in just a moment. Congress is considering right now, currently debating the most significant changes to the APA in 7 decades. Finally, many of the administrative law cases decided during the 1940s still otherwise control today, and they have immediate relevancy to current debates. So there have been modern debates about the Chevron doctrine, and just briefly, that's the doctrine that governs when Article III courts are supposed to defer to executive interpretations of laws. Understanding that doctrine, the entire doctrine is illuminated by looking at its roots in 1940s case law. And further afield, the case law even has implications for issues like the Fourth Amendment's third-party doctrine, which is about when a private individual loses a Fourth Amendment interest to information turned over to a third party like a business, which the Supreme Court is currently considering, may well reconsider this fall in a case called Carpenter versus United States. So let me just get to the changes that occurred during the 1940s. First, the scope of judicial review of executive action. Entering the 1940s, we have a prevailing consensus on the scope of judicial review that's captured by rules that the Supreme Court spells out in a 1932 decision called Kroll versus Benson. In that case, writing for the court, Chief Justice Hughes said that Congress could not withdraw from judicial cognizance any matter which from its nature is the subject of a suit at the common law or in equity or in admiralty. And according to him, the flexibility to use administrative fact-finding does not extend to questions that are, quote, fundamental or jurisdictional. That, according to the court in Kroll, is a question of constitutional magnitude. And the basic point that's being made is that there's a constitutional scheme, and Congress cannot substitute for constitutional courts in which the judicial power of the United States is vested the decisions of an administrative agency. And the contours of this framework that result from the Kroll decision can be expressed as follows. First, the court presupposes, it doesn't hold, but it presupposes that courts review legal questions de novo without deference to agencies. And second, where private rights are concerned, agencies get deference for their fact-finding, but not for what are known as jurisdictional or constitutional facts. And that's a distinction that was debated then, and it remains unclear exactly what that meant today. This was a doctrine that people really cared about, they still do care about, and so Justice Frankfurter, who was at the time a professor at Harvard Law School, immediately following the decision, he wrote a letter to Justice Stone, who was a justice at the time, and he said that he was in mourning after the Kroll decision, and it made him wonder whether law was really his beat. So things in this area change in the 1940s, and I'm just going to pick a couple of examples of how they change. In a 1941 case, which is called Gray versus Powell, Justice Reed, who's the authoring justice in the case, he starts to apply the pre-existing Kroll framework, and I can see this because I found the drafts in the opinion, and he starts to apply that framework and tries to fit the case within the logical, the categories that Chief Justice Hughes set forth in Kroll, and over time he finds it difficult in a way to apply that framework to the facts of the case, and we end up with a decision in final format that is quite different from Kroll as Chief Justice Hughes would have envisioned it. And the final result of the opinion in Gray versus Powell is that judicial review of the legal question is inappropriate because Congress has delegated the function of interpreting the statutory term to the agency, which has expert and experienced judgment in this area. So what's really fascinating about the draft opinions, I'll just briefly mention this, is that Justice Reed starts by looking into when the court has categorized certain questions as questions of fact and certain questions as questions of law. In a variety of cases, he writes pages on this subject that are ultimately cut because other justices on the court say, this is just too complicated. We don't really know how to do this type of analysis. And he starts by saying that there is some relevance to this category of jurisdictional fact that was mentioned in Kroll. And he gets a letter from Justice Frankfurter that says, I think we really should take this out because talk of jurisdictional fact or constitutional fact is rubbish. It's a misleading irrelevancy. And Reed removes the reference, thus subtly changing the standard of review, which then gets incorporated into later cases. So I will just briefly touch upon what happens next, which is that in 1941 we have this case, Gray versus Powell, and in 1946 Congress enacts a statute which is supposed to speak to this issue, that's the APA, and the statute says, and I'm quoting, the court shall decide constitutional and statutory, shall interpret constitutional and statutory provisions and determining the meaning or applicability of the terms of an agency action. And it has a reference in there as well to courts' review of agency jurisdiction. And one way to understand the statute is that the Congress is thinking of the Kroll versus Benson framework, which used much of the same language and is reacting in a way to the changes that the court is making to its jurisprudence in terms of the standard of review during the same era. So we have some challenges here about understanding what the terms of the statute mean against the backdrop of the jurisprudence. I'll just quickly turn to the second issue that I had mentioned, which is what kind of techniques may agencies use to conduct government investigations. And that's interesting because the governing legal framework on this issue also undergoes a very serious change during the 1940s. The Fourth Amendment says that the rights of the people in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall be secured. And it prohibits, just broadly speaking, unreasonable, often thought to be warrantless searches of documents. And in 1886, the Supreme Court had said that a compelled disclosure of information through subpoena was, in fact, a constructive search within the meaning of the Fourth Amendment. Against this backdrop, administrative subpoenas were understood to issue only when the standard for the Fourth Amendment was met. And in a variety of cases up to the 1940s, the court essentially held, either interpreting these administrative subpoena statutes or applying Fourth Amendment principles, that the administrative agency had to meet the Fourth Amendment standards for probable cause or some sort of relevancy to an actual investigation. And what happens is that in the 1940s, the court changes this framework. In fact, if you look at this 1953 treatise written by the famous law professor Louis Jaffe, he says that nothing in the law better illustrates the enormously increased reach of government in the last 50 years than does the broadening of the power of administrative investigation. And what happens is that the court says, rather than having to meet the standard for probable cause in the Fourth Amendment during this era, you can simply meet a lower reasonableness standard. So the compelled documents have to be reasonably related to an investigation. And this principle has extremely far-reaching consequences that we still live with today. So I mentioned this doctrine known as the third-party doctrine a few moments ago, which is currently being considered by the Supreme Court. Well, one can imagine that when the government obtains the authority to compel disclosure of documents using a reduced standard, which is what happens during the 1940s, it is able nowadays to do so from businesses that possess documents related to other people's interests. So I'm thinking of phone records or bank records, things of that nature, and do so using a reasonableness standard. And so there's just been this change in the authority of the government to get that type of information. And the way in which the court is reacting in the area of the Fourth Amendment is to wonder whether individuals have Fourth Amendment interests in the information that is held by businesses separately. So there's this way in which we are still living with the consequences of the court's shift in the Fourth Amendment standard for administrative investigations to this day, and the ramifications are still to be spelled out. I'll stop right there.
Thank you.
So the reason I'm here is Michael McConnell called me, and when he calls and asks, you try to find a way to say yes. And he said, someone far smarter and more prominent than you just dropped out. And she wanted to write about these American Bar Association resolutions to modernize the APA. Is that something you might be interested in? And I thought, well, yeah. I sat on the governing council of the ABA's administrative law section when we developed these resolutions. I'll write the paper about this. And when I started to write the paper, I thought, what I'm going to do, and I think I told Michael this on the phone, I'm going to say that these are a good foundation or starting point, but we've got to do a lot more. Now, at the same time, I had just joined Senator Hatch's office first semester to work on regulatory reform and judicial nominations. And across my desk comes the latest version of the Regulatory Accountability Act, draft legislation that Senators Heitkamp and Portman and Hatch and Manchin ultimately ended up originally co-sponsoring. And my view of this paper changed. And so we will save the how can we do more for the third panel. And I want to talk about what we can do now in this unique political climate where there might be opportunities for some bipartisanship reform of the Administrative Procedure Act. And Aditya set me up pretty well for this. The Administrative Procedure Act was enacted in 1946. Westlaw tells me that it's only been amended 16 times in the last 70 years. I found a couple more, but it's still less than 20. There have only really been 3 major amendments to the Administrative Procedure Act, the Freedom of Information Act in 1966, the Privacy Act in 1974, the Sunshine in the Government Act in 1976. Then I would add in another one in 1976 that changed the waiver of sovereign immunity, would be probably, in my mind, the fourth. So if we're looking at the last time there was a major legislative change, it was about 40 years ago. And that doesn't mean, though, and Aditya's paper fleshes this out even more, that it hasn't changed, the Administrative Procedure Act. When Congress doesn't act, we see that courts do. And there's been a lot of what's been termed administrative common law that has been created that has added a lot of meat, sometimes meat that really doesn't have a statutory foundation in the Administrative Procedure Act. But courts, and the Supreme Court and the D.C. Circuit in particular, have really led this charge. I think this is a unique opportunity in this political climate for regulatory reform. Republicans in Congress have been clamoring for it for the last 8 years. Now the shoe is on the other foot, and the Democrats might want to lock in the gains they have made over the last 8 years through the regulatory process. And we have a president in the White House who, at least according to some of his advisors, is interested in a deconstruction of the administrative state. So there's some interest in an idea of regulatory reform. And I think something like the Regulatory Accountability Act is the type of bipartisan reform that could actually happen. And I want to, in my kind of short time today, I want to focus on 3 points that are in the paper of why I think this is the type of bipartisan reform that needs to happen. And the first is that it's based on a foundation of pretty bipartisan, consensus-driven, if we're using the words common sense, reforms to the Administrative Procedure Act. Do I need one more?
Wine dark sea.
Oh. And we know that because it adopts 7 of the 9 resolutions, recommendations that the American Bar Association approved in January 2006 or 2016, and these are to kind of give you a sense of what would change. For instance, it would amend the APA to say that an agency, when they're doing informal rulemaking, no comment rulemaking, they have to actually have a public record of the rulemaking, and they have to disclose any scientific studies, reports that they actually developed or relied on. It seems like it would be probably pretty non-controversial. I'd kind of side note this. Critics of the Regulatory Accountability Act, one of their main criticisms is that this puts science on trial, because now you're going to be able to actually see the inputs and the outputs. And so there are definitely criticisms. I think that's one of the weaker ones that's out there. It also would set minimum times for public comment. Right now, the Administrative Procedure Act doesn't say how long you have to have a public comment. And it says 30 days for regular rules and 60 days for high-impact rules. And we'll get back to high-impact rules in a minute. And these are recommendations that the American Bar Association and the Administrative Conference of the United States, it's a federal agency that does research on federal agencies, have recommended for years. ABA has been doing this since the 70s on those type of things. But it also addresses some more modern issues that we have, such as the growing trend of agencies bypassing notice and comment rulemaking and just issuing final interim rules. And then maybe on the back end going back, it makes it a lot harder for agencies to do that. And when they do that, it holds them accountable for actually doing notice and comment afterwards. It would also address midnight rulemaking, which is the rules that are made at the very end of a presidential administration. It provides for statutory provisions to have those paused. Some of that's already done by executive order, but it provides a statutory foundation for controlling the ability of an outgoing president to lock in a new incoming president with something that perhaps the people who voted for that new president wouldn't have agreed with. And it also deals with retrospective review of outdated rules, which is a really hot topic in administrative law and regulatory in the policy and scholarly field of encouraging agencies to routinely look at the rules they have in the books and figure out which ones no longer serve their purpose. It also, in that sense, has a petitioning process for the public can say, we think this rule is outdated. And you see a lot of this in what the Trump administration is doing right now through executive order. The difference is this is actually Congress now making it part of the statutory framework. The other way in that it builds on a foundation, a consensus-driven foundation, is that it adopts a lot, not all, but a lot of the best practices that presidents dating back to Reagan have implemented for economic analysis in the rulemaking process. So we're talking like Executive Order 1866 from Clinton, and just saying, you've got agencies, you've got to identify your purpose, you've got to not full-blown formalize cost-benefit analysis, but at least you've got to do some of these, best practices. Cass Sunstein has an op-ed in Bloomberg yesterday where he praises this part of the Regulatory Accountability Act of being a much-needed reform to the Administrative Procedure Act. Okay, so that's point number one. The foundation of the legislation is this consensus-driven common sense. It also, though, involves a lot of important compromises. Just like the APA, when it was enacted in 1946, that was the result of over a decade of Republicans and Democrats trying to set the default rules for the New Deal state, administrative state. And you see the same types of compromises in the Regulatory Accountability Act. So for one, Republicans have long been asking for more transparency and public accountability for agency rulemaking, and the bill does provide for that. It, in some ways, reinvigorates formal rulemaking, where agencies have to have public hearings on rules, where they have to consider evidence, where interested parties get to cross-examine experts. This is a very controversial area. The ABA does not agree with this, but where the compromise is that it only applies to high-impact rules. So rules that have at least $100 million economic impact on the economy, economic impact, or over $1 billion. And the distinction there is that agencies have a lot of leeway to say, no, we're not going to do a public hearing for rules less than $1 billion, and they have very little leeway for rules that have more than $1 billion economic impact. And so you see, these types of compromises there. There's also still a good cause exception built in there, where an agency can bypass that if they can show that it's impractical and necessary, or contrary to the purposes of the rulemaking process in that particular rule. I kind of put this in perspective. I think that the U.S. Chamber tells us that over the last 9 years, there have been 140 total rules that would be over this $100 million impact. I think 28 of those, I don't have that in my notes, but I think it's 28 of them would have been over the $1 billion impact. And so we're dealing with a small subset of rules, and if we have, if people are interested to comment, this is probably the most controversial part of the Regulatory Accountability Act, so we can return that in the comments. I do think if agencies are going to be dealing at this level order of magnitude, that Congress should probably be legislating and not agencies in the first place. My basic kind of gut reaction is that this type of more formalized process with a public hearing and a chance to cross-examine makes a lot of sense. Now, there are a number of other really important compromises. One is obviously this good cause exception that goes throughout all the procedures. There's a change from, and Cass Sunstein didn't like this, and I understand. The Republican version in the House of this legislation is the least costly rule they have to adopt. In the bipartisan Senate version, it's the most cost-effective. Another thing that you see there is that there's a presumption of reasonableness if the agency considers at least 3 alternatives. So they don't have to consider everything. If they have 3 from a judicial review perspective, that's going to be presumptively reasonable. And then I think one of the more important compromises there is that there's a savings clause. So any other, and it does not trump other organic statutes the agencies have if there are different procedures already in place in another statute. This legislation would not upset those procedures. So you see some of these kind of compromises. On the judicial review front, it seems, and I argue in the paper, although the legislation doesn't specifically say it, I think that it adopts more of a hard look review under arbitrary and capricious, the way that it sets up the type of economic analysis that needs to be done. It's requiring the agency to engage in reasoned decision making and codifying that hard look review that the Supreme Court and the D.C. Circuit have been developing over the last 30 years. At the same time, on the flip side, it also codifies remand without vacature, which is something that a lot of right-of-center folks don't like. The idea that a court can say, agency, your rule is invalid, but we're going to let you have it remain in place while you fix a deficiency. And so you see these kind of trade-offs. And similarly, Republicans in Congress have been pushing for the last at least 4 years to get rid of both Chevron deference, the deference that agencies get for their interpretations of statutes, and our deference, the deference that they get for their interpretations of their own regulations. And this legislation doesn't touch Chevron deference. It only gets rid of our deference. And when it gets rid of our deference, it doesn't default back to de novo review. it goes to more of a standard-like process of what they call Skidmore review, which looks at factors that the agency could show of a power to persuade. And I think this demonstrates, this is not what the Republicans would roll out if they were doing this on their own. It's more of a compromise. And I want to spend just a couple seconds on this. I think this is interesting because one of the concerns you have about making rulemaking harder, that agencies have to do more and expend more resources, they have to be more deliberative, is that agencies might be tempted to shift to guidance, right? And so, like the Regulatory Accountability Act, you could imagine, all right, we're going to make agencies do this and be smarter and more deliberative about what they're doing. The agency response might be, well, I can go do guidance, and I still get hour deference. And according to the empirical studies, I win as much under hour as I do under Chevron. So what am I doing, right? One interesting feature of the Regulatory Accountability Act is by getting rid of hour but keeping Chevron, in some ways it's trying to rebalance those incentives. So, all right, you have to do a little bit more to do rulemaking now, but you get the reward of Chevron deference as opposed to hour. And I think that's something that might have a fascinating incentives for how agencies function. The last thing I want to just say, the third point here, and I only need 30 seconds for this one, is it's the timing of this. The Republicans that are still pushing for this legislation, they now control the White House. They want to deregulate. Nothing in the legislation distinguishes between regulating and deregulating. In other words, this is a way that Democrats can lock in the gains they've made over the last 8 years. It's going to be, agencies are going to have to show, be more rigorous in their economic analysis of rulemaking and follow these procedures. And so I think that's another flavor of this, bipartisanship. At the same time, I think it's the type of thing that a Trump administration would be interested in passing because it does lock in the rules for the game. And Go and watch the press conference from Heidkamp in Portman, because at the very end of it, they're asked this, like, why are you doing this? You won. Like, go forth and deregulate. And Portman says, this is about setting the right procedures. This is about modernizing the Administrative Procedure Act to make agencies more accountable and transparent when they're rulemaking. So I'll stop there.
So I'll follow Charles's lead in calling on about 3 people at a time. We do have 35 minutes, so yes. So here and then others? Will? Yes.
I'm Lauren Thompson. Passage and implementation of the Affordable Care Act, that's a high water mark for what principles of governance in your mind? To the whole panel.
So 2 different questions, one for Chris and one for Vicki. For Chris, I'd be curious to know, obviously you're sort of focusing on the things that are in the proposal, but I'd be curious if you have thoughts on some other low-hanging fruit or other things that might be in there that you think would be a good thing to add to the modernizing. And in particular, I'm just wondering if you have a view about some other kind of remedial reform. So now there's a big debate about the law, say, of nationwide injunctions and how much power does a single district court have over a nationwide agency. I think both sides claim that the current law supports their view, so this might be a ripe for Congress to codify whatever it thinks the rule is, or to pick the better rule, and I'd be curious about anything else. For Vicki, I was thinking about another way to try to implement the sort of the relationship between democratic accountability and federalism doctrine. And here's one you may not like, but if not, I'd be curious to know why. Is maybe this could have a sort of separation of powers insight when we look at preemption at the federal level. So one of the things that happens more and more is that the decision to preempt state law is not made by Congress, but is instead made by the administrative agency, either because Congress delegates it to them or because the agency decides, what laws it wants to preempt. And since administrative agencies are presumably have the biggest democratic deficit of all at the national level, being neither the president nor Congress, I could imagine that when an administrative agency is up against a democratically elected state, that maybe it should get less deference. And you might think of it even sort of stepping back that in the normal administrative law context, statutory gaps, the idea is they go to the agency to be filled in. But maybe if a state has tried to fill the gap, in essence, we should think that gets some weight because at least the state has a democratic answer. And again, that wouldn't always work. Sometimes a state solution would be impossible, but maybe there should be a sort of thumb on the scale against preemption in that kind of circumstance.
This is a question for Vicki. So I guess I can briefly disclose I did some consulting for a political party in Europe, and one of the things I did was to design the program where we optimize where our candidates should appear. And where we decided where our candidates should appear depended on the electoral rules. So we got a number of votes. Had the system had been different, we would have got a different number of votes. Trump optimized where to show up. Hillary decided to waste one day in Arizona. Is there any way in which we can say there were more Americans supporting Hillary or Al Gore than George Bush or Trump? No. I don't understand what this democratic legitimacy means. Under certain rules of the game, everyone optimized, and they got some results. Under other rules of the game, other things will happen. Electoral systems and votes are endogenous.
So let me, and thank you very much, both of you, for your questions and comments. So I agree that at the, at the Electoral College level, it's really hard to know what to make, because if the rules of the game were different, the candidates would have campaigned differently. And so I don't place a huge amount of weight on that. I do not think that we can say quite the same thing about the malapportionment problem in the Senate. And I know a little bit about comparative federalism. And I'm not aware of any other successful constitutional democratic federal system that has the degree of malapportionment that we have. It's very common in federal systems to have some overrepresentation in the national government of smaller units in order to promote the goals of pluralism and allowing difference. But, and in the paper I have some figures for you from Australia and Germany, I think. But the degree of malapportionment that exists in the Senate is quite large. And in the paper, there's a footnote raising the point you just raised to me, which is seems absolutely right. You don't really know how the vote would have turned out if we had, in fact, a national referendum on who should be president, because both sides might have changed their campaign strategy. So that's right, but it doesn't get at the Senate problem. Will, on your question, I actually, in the paper, it went by kind of fast, talked about administrative preemption, and that one might, in light of my observation, it's one thing to say, well, we're going to, if the Congress has written a statute and a fair reading of it is preemptive, even though it's imperfect, it's what we got at the national level. And maybe a different matter if Congress hasn't spoken to it, because then you don't even clearly have a democratic decision at the national level. You have an expert decision. And so, some scholars have said, well, agencies shouldn't be able to preempt unless there's specific authority from Congress. Some have said, well, agencies can preempt, but only if they change their procedures to take better account of federalism kinds of interests. And I don't know which of these, because I am actually not an ad law person, but I think the observation does support thinking along those lines. And moreover, I do think that some knowledge of comparative federalism suggests that you actually can have systems with a fair amount of concurrent lawmaking and regulation. So even if a federal agency is filling a gap, states might be able to fill the gap a little differently without creating a real conflict. Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Yes, the Council of States in Switzerland is even more malapportioned than the US. Zurich has 1.5 million people, Appenzellern has 14,000, same number of representatives.
That certainly should make us all feel better.
So I'm so tempted to kind of interact a little bit more with Will's question too before I jump to the what should we change. Miriam Sieft's been writing some really cool things on like state level. She has her newest piece on gubernatorial administration. It's just fascinating. It's a little bit of a tangent, but if you're a political accountability fan of agency deference, in some ways, state agencies have they're more politically accountable because their heads of the departments are oftentimes elected. And I think that's kind of an interesting, I don't know how that fits in with the story, but it does fit in with your overall story of should we return to the states? It's not just that we're electing a state legislature and a governor in a way that might be more democratic, that we're actually electing the heads of agencies in most states And that adds a really fascinating wrinkle to the federalism story, at least from an administrative law scholar perspective. Now, turning to other things to modernize the Administrative Procedure Act, the biggest one that the ABA did not do and the Regulatory Accountability Act did not do is not tackle adjudication. And I think that's an area that's ripe for bipartisan reform. Michael Asimov for the Administrative Conference of the United States has done amazing work chronicling how much of adjudication happens outside of the APA. In other words, when we think about agency adjudication, it's not the formal adjudication that the APA commands. The vast majority of adjudication is done through organic statutes of agencies, and they don't have all the same procedures. The ABA and ACUS have both recommended a lot of ways to make sure that there's due process, to make sure that there's a judicial record to review. And I think Congress, although apparently ACUS disagrees with me and thinks the agency should have discretion, I think Congress should play a really prominent role in reining in agency adjudication and making sure that there's due process, that there's sufficient judicial review. And the recommendations that ACUS put out and that the ABA put out about 10 years ago are ones that Congress should really revisit. Another area, the Regulatory Accountability Act does talk about guidance, but it really, as I say in the paper, I don't know what it's doing. It kind of redefines it. It doesn't really add anything to it, but that's an area that Congress needs to think more critically about. And then on the judicial remedies side, I mean, I did mention some of the things. I don't know if that's, I don't know about, I'm not sure what the answer is on nationwide injunctions, like from a policy perspective, what Congress should actually do. And I'm not sure if there's like bipartisan consensus around that either. We were talking like offline before, I do think there might be some areas for the court to rethink some of its, perhaps, its ripeness, judiciability standards for guidance. And that might be another area where there might be some more consensus, but yeah. And I'm not going to answer, we're going to leave Aditya to answer the question about the Affordable Care Act.
Well, I don't have a brilliant answer on that other than, I suppose, my gut instinct is to say that we should judge the process of legislation by the results. And so, it's been, and I think you were talking about the Affordable Care Act as enacted a decade ago, or yes. Yeah, so in the sense that, legislating has always been messy, and some of it is done in the shadows, and some of it is done out in the open, and it's not a perfect process. It's just the process that we have, and whether there are some set of ground rules that could improve that process, that's entirely possible. But I think we'll always live with this aspect of messiness in putting together laws.
How are you?
So I actually have a question comment for Aditya, but before that, responding to Chris' comment on adjudication, a plug for the first symposium that this group did, because a majority of those papers actually relate to rule of law concerns. It's in the Journal of Legal Analysis coming out of informal adjudication. I think when we each wrote them, I know I didn't see that common theme, but that is a common theme. They're almost all about informal adjudication, and you're right that that's a huge place where the rubber is meeting the road with rule of law concerns. For Aditya, for future work, because I know you are very interested in the administrative process and these third parties and information collecting, what would be curious for you to explore is how much of the development in that area is really grounded in anything about empowering administrative agencies, and how much of it is almost a legal accident of the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on grand juries. Because what happens is the Supreme Court in the grand jury area, that's where they first said you don't need probable cause because grand juries are investigative, right? And so you need only a reasonable basis, not probable cause. The Fourth Amendment is redefined to not be privacy protecting and to really just limit fishing expeditions. So the grand jury case law just transforms the Fourth, and then it's the grand jury case law, the third parties, who cares about the Fourth Amendment? It's the Fifth Amendment that's driving that train. They say in a grand jury context, Corporations don't have Fifth Amendment rights. Agents for corporations don't have Fifth Amendment rights. People holding documents for other people don't have those people's Fifth Amendment rights. And people don't have Fifth Amendment rights in the contents of their documents anyway. It's only in the act of production, i.e., your act of production is testimonial. Sorry to those of you who are not lawyers, because this would make no sense if you're not a lawyer. But anyway, the Fifth Amendment for documents is defined down to not existing if you don't have the documents. The agencies have nothing to do with it, and then they're the beneficiaries, right? Once you have that all laid out in the grand jury context, how do you turn around and say, oh, it's different for agencies? So it would be worth exploring that as you develop this. Did the court make a mistake in not treating agencies differently? How much do agencies have anything to do with this development of the law?
My question is for a comment, particularly from Ms. Jackson, about your comparison that the states are more, quote, democratic because they don't have the Senate malapportionment. What effect would you, or a criticism of that or a weakness of that would be the Shelby County case where essentially the Voting Rights Act has been transformed from where the burden of proof is on the plaintiff rather than the way it was before, and then combine that with the suppression of votes by kind of pretextual means of identification to limit tiny voter fraud versus the widespread or versus disenfranchisement, and then connect that with the gerrymander. If you capture the state legislature, then you can gerrymander and significantly reverse some of the major, what many would call benefits of the Voting Rights Act and the one man, one vote. So I would be interested in your comments or the comments of other parties. And then one other question with respect to Shelby County versus Holder. It seems to me you have an amendment to the Constitution that says Congress can make laws to enforce it. And then, as I read Shelby County versus Holder, the people in favor of Shelby County, the justices in favor of Shelby County, were weighing whether the evidence that Congress elicited was, I'm sure there are weaknesses in any argument as to why you want to renew the Voting Rights Act, but I think they kind of cherry-picked the weaknesses by saying, well, this is a 50-year-old problem, but of course it's not. So I'd be interested in your comments or comments of anyone else as to, particularly, and I apologize for going on, but we hear that, well, if you want to change the law, you just amend the Constitution. If something's unconstitutional, it seems to me that they did change the law. They made it unconstitutional to discriminate against Voting Rights Act, against voting ability, and they said Congress can do it. And then the Supreme Court, through its laws or through its interpretation of that constitutional act, I can't imagine that the people who promoted the amendments to the Constitution would have felt that that the Supreme Court had the ability to overturn Congress's deliberations.
Professor Walker, going back to H.R. 5 and the deference part of that bill, besides what you've already mentioned, what are the other downsides you see to getting rid of Chevron through legislation? And so the folks I talked to in the House are pretty set on something like that. So I'm just wondering if you had to do something that was more politically palatable in the Senate, would it be Skidmore, or is there another option available?
Absolutely. So that's a great question, Jennifer, and it's a nuance that I didn't mention today and should be spelled out more in the paper. As I recall, in the 1953 Jaffe Treatise, he talks about this very issue and the relationship between the administrative subpoena power and grand juries. It's a topic that was in the air at the time, and the basic point that you make, which is that it appears that through the grand jury process, the government could compel disclosure of various documents and information using a very low standard. Why does that not translate to the administrative subpoena context, just a fortiori? As it so happens, there were arguments that it does not, and the arguments are ones that you could you can very well imagine and understand, such as the grand jury process is governed, it was overseen by a judge, and it's different when we're talking about administrative subpoenas, even though now sometimes they are approved by judges, and there are different ways in which you can get them issued. Nevertheless, there was this argument in the air, and so it's something that should be looked into, and I think it's something that the court might actually look into when they're deciding this Carpenter case sometime in the fall. The one other thing that I'll just note is that what was interesting to me is that in the 1940s cases that I mention and discuss in the paper, that actually is not a big theme in the cases. That's not a theme in the reasoning. They don't reason that because we allow this type of investigative tool to be used in the grand jury context, we ought to allow it in the administrative context as well. So for whatever that's worth, the case law developed based on a different type of reasoning.
Okay, so on your excellent question about Shelby County, I've written at some length on that in the paper. I disagreed with the court's decision. Okay, on the theory, if Congress is legislating to respond to states' denial of rights to vote, I don't think the states have any greater democratic legitimacy, because at that point they're excluding people. So that's the first thing I say in there. The second thing, and I'm worried about gerrymandering, and I'm worried about what will happen after Shelby County, and I mentioned that in the paper. But in the theory is, if what Congress is responding to is voter exclusion or burdens or discrimination in the states, I don't think there's any democratic advantage in the state legislative process. The other thing in terms of Congress's power under the 14th Amendment. There's a really long legal story that I don't have time to go through now, but here's what I do want to say. I agree with you that I believe the court should have given more deference to Congress's fact-finding. There was an extensive legislative record when the Voting Rights Act was renewed, which the court was reviewing. And in the paper, I talk about an old Supreme Court case from the 1930s where a challenge was brought to whether an amendment had been open too long for ratification. This was the Child Labor Amendment, and the court says that whether it's open for too long a time is for Congress to decide. We don't have the tools. There are so many factors that bear on that. So why, in the statutory context, doesn't Congress get that same deference? And I also say in the paper, you all may disagree, many of you may disagree with me, that the idea that the racist attitudes underlying the system of racial hierarchy in the South, which existed at least until the 1960s when the Voting Rights Act starts taking apart, the idea that that's just gone is implausible to me as a matter of human society, because people who are in power now were raised by parents or grandparents, many of whom would have supported the racial hierarchy. So I think I have many reasons why I disagree with Shelby. And if I could just say a word to my colleague over there who asked me about Switzerland. So assuming Wiki is reliable, which is a big assumption, but what I wanted to look up is I remembered that some of the cantons in Switzerland are treated as half cantons for purpose. Appenzell, I believe,
is a half canton,
but
yes.
It only gets one.
Jura has two. And I just did the numbers for Argentina.
Okay,
if you are from Tierra del Fuego, your vote costs 123 times more than if you are from Provincia de Buenos Aires. Your vote in California, 67 times.
Right. Okay.
So your statement was wrong.
That may be, and I'm happy to be corrected, but to evaluate it, you'd also need to know things like what the voting rules are for overriding vetoes, what the rules are for amendment. In Switzerland, it's a majority of the cantons and a majority of the population. Here, it's 3/4 of the states and 2/3 of the Congress. So the effects of the malapportionment, I'm happy to be corrected and to learn, but the effects of the malapportionment may vary depending upon the other voting rules in the system.
Chris?
So we could have a whole conference or panels on what to do with Chevron deference. And in fact, I think I've done at least 7 or 8 of those in the last 2 years at the American Constitutional Society, at Federal Society, several law reviews of published whole issues. And so there's a lot to say there. I want to make 2 points because I've thought a lot about Chevron deference. In fact, a co-author and I, Kent Benner, and I just finished, we spent 3 years coding every circuit court decision that deals with Chevron deference over an 11-year period. And the 2 points I have, one of the common things that existed before we started talking about Chevron, whether you should get rid of it, was it doesn't really matter. And there's this famous study at the Supreme Court by Bill Eskridge and Lauren Barrow that basically says the Supreme Court uses it however they want, and it doesn't matter. And that to me just seemed wrong. I mean, I agree with them that the Supreme Court uses it however they want, but it's not really the right question. I think the right questions are, does it matter to agencies? And does it matter in the circuit courts where the vast majority of Chevron decisions are made? And on the agency level, I went out and surveyed 128 rulemakers across 14 different agencies several years ago, and sure enough, at least some support for the idea that agencies are more aggressive in their interpretive efforts if they know they have Chevron, as opposed to Skidmore de novo. And at the circuit court level, it wouldn't be surprised to anyone who litigates or who reads Chevron decisions. It makes a difference at the circuit court level. In our sample of Chevron cases, they won 78% of the time when Chevron applied, 56% of the time when Skidmore applied, and 40% of the time when de novo review. Now, there are huge selection issues with that. I mean, I don't, but like just to give you a sense of the difference, if Congress were to change the deference standard, you would see I think, a pretty dramatic difference in how agencies, how aggressive they are in advancing interpretations, and how circuit courts do in reviewing them. Now, whether I think it's a good thing or not, I'm actually not sure. I think Chevron plays a role. If you're going to replace it, do you go to something like Skidmore? If you say de novo review, like HR 5 says, are courts really going to do de novo review, or are they going to do Skidmore? I think they'll probably do Skidmore. So there are lots of open questions. On our, I feel much more confident that it's time. I'm not going to use any puns, but its time is done. But Chevron, I think, is a much more complicated question.
I really am enjoying the discussion of malapportionment, and I as an economist, I've been thinking about how to understand malapportionment and also how to understand how things could be different at the national level and at the state level. Why maybe this isn't so contradictory. So let's think about the history of malapportionment in Canada, which I'm pretty familiar with. And that was actually the solution to a problem. The problem was the complementarities geographically across the Canadian provinces. The point is that in Canada, you can't get to the west except through what was French Canada, which at that point was called Lower Canada. And the problem was that the original solution that the British came up with for Canada was to have Lower Canada and Upper Canada pretty much administered separately. That was Pitt's solution. And they found out that that wasn't workable. And the reason was because the Lower Canadians, the French Canadians, realized that they could hold up the development of Western Canada by refusing to allow canal development to occur as part of their suing for independence. And so the whole point of malapportionment in the Canadian Constitution in 1866, which followed the example of their initial decision in 1841, was to dilute the French ability to block something that was of a complementarity, a geographic complementarity across the provinces. So I think it's an interesting other dimension to think of, because you could imagine that for some set of democracy problems, you'd want to have malapportionment at the level for deciding certain kinds of things for which there are these complementarities, but you might not need malapportionment for deciding other kinds of things that are more local. So in that sense, maybe these two things, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the optimum solution, but for example, it was very much a choice in the Canadian Constitution to create these states, these provinces that were very sparsely populated. They had one really great feature. There weren't a lot of French there. And that was not a coincidence. That was very much chosen because that made the Senate able to block French populist obstructionism.
So I have a question for Aditya. So
when you read Crowell v. Benson in a sort of naively, it reads pretty reasonably. It has a lot of roots in, in traditional understandings of separation of powers. It seems like a pretty good decision. And yet, as you say, in Graver versus Powell and later cases, partly under the spur of Frankfurter's acid tongue, they move away from that. So I'm just wondering, do you have an opinion? Is Crowell actually something that we could return to as a foundation for administrative law, or was it something as bad as Frankfurter thought, and that the court was right to move away from it?
So I've thought about it. I have some inclinations here, but obviously this is a big question that can be debated. My hunch is that Crowell, the framework that's created in Crowell, which I briefly touched on and it's explored more in the paper, is a framework that seems to be mirrored in the APA, is something that is workable. And it is workable in the way in which Stanley Reed once tried to make it work, and that is that we have these categories, and we are going to try to do some sort of Langdellian analysis of what fact is, or what law is, or what jurisdictional fact is, based on the preceding cases in which we had categorized certain types of decisions as fact or law. And that is the sort of in the weeds analysis that would be necessary in order to make Crowell work. So there's just what I take away in a sense from the Gray versus Powell drafting process is that one might look at the recent debates about Chevron and take away from that, from the debates, that if the government were to get rid of Chevron, if Congress were to get rid of Chevron, or the court were to say Chevron is no longer the law, it would simply be a matter of courts deciding de novo how various terms and statutes should be understood. And it's not quite that easy. And I think the Stanley Reed opinion in Gray versus Powell suggests that there would be complications in figuring out which interpretive questions are thought of as legal and which are thought of as factual. And that type of categorization would have to be conducted in order to make the framework work. So hopefully that's somewhat responsive to the question. I think it's workable, and I have...
Of course, courts make the distinction between legal and factual questions in the summary judgment context, literally a dozen times a day.
That is exactly right. That is true. Of course, there's also a robust literature and evidence law, and part of the undermining of Crowell versus Benson has its roots in this literature, in which scholars have criticized that distinction between law and fact in the law of evidence and what goes to a jury, what should be decided by a judge. So many of the progressive scholars who are writing in the 1930s who had criticisms of Crowell v. Benson, they relied on this treatise that was written by James Bradley Thayer in the early 1900s, or perhaps the late 19th century, in which he said in the law of evidence, it's an evidence law treatise, that law and fact, these are really not two a priori distinct categories, but rather we're really making an institutional analysis. Who's better at making this decision, a jury or a judge? And the progressive thinkers thought that the same basic logic should govern judicial review of agency action. It should just be an institutional analysis type of question. And that's what leads to Chevron. And so I think the difference between the old Crowell v. Benson framework and the Chevron framework is, should we think of the standard of review from an institutional analysis perspective, or should we think of it from a formal legal categorization perspective?
Vicki, did you want to comment on
Charles' comment? So, so here are my thoughts. They're not in particular. Number one, in the mid-19th century, very few, if any, countries had developed the kinds of public law commitments to equality of voting that the U.S. developed really starting in the 1960s, and so that's one contextual factor. Second, I'm not sure whether the interests in complementarity are about democracy or about material well-being. I'm just not sure which set of values they concern. I totally agree that there are sensible reasons to provide overrepresentation or underrepresentation when you're putting together a federal system. And I've said that several times in the paper. The degree here is quite substantial. We have to have further conversations to resolve quite how severe it is in the world. The last thing is the Senate. You know more than I do about its original purpose, but what I believe I know now in Canada is that the Senate is actually extremely weak and tends rarely to oppose the popular House because it's appointed and is not regarded as having democratic legitimacy. So I don't know what we do with that, but those are the things that occurred to me as you were speaking.
Thank the panel very much, and it's...
So the first speaker in our panel is Chris Demuth.
At conferences like this on regulation, over-regulation, the rule of law over the past several years, can you hear me? There have been three recurrent themes. One is that too much federal government is being done by the executive branch. There's been too much migration, too much power, unilateral discretion being exercised by the executive branch. The second is Congress has become passive, afraid to make controversial decisions. It needs to get back in the act and restore a constitutional balance of branches. And third, that the federal government is just doing too much. It's regulating too much of the economy. There's too much over-regulation leading to perverse consequences, unnecessary polarization of the society, and so forth. By those criteria, there seem to be many opportunities for reform that the Trump administration and the congressional Republicans, the new dispensation in Washington, seem to be pursuing energetically and with some prospects of success. On the Congress front, Congress has, on 14 occasions since the new Congress took office, has repealed major regulatory initiatives under the Congressional Review Act, an act which had been passed in the 1990s, had only been used once before. Many of these regulations were very costly, were highly controversial. They were the kind of things that one could attack Congress for being indifferent to widely held values. But Congress stood up and repealed these acts. So it's actually been making regulatory decisions of a kind that we have not been used to for a very long while. Second, President Trump, although he sounded during his campaign to be something of a unilateralist, he often expressed admiration for President Obama's unilateral ways. He didn't sound like much of a deregulator. He didn't like EPA, but he sounded like an antitrust activist. He sounded like he might want to use regulatory powers in one way or another. Turns out to be a pretty conventional and pretty much of a full spectrum deregulator if you leave immigration and trade aside. He's made some wonderful appointments, including people that we recognize because they're academics and they've been to conferences like ours. And I would say Ajit Pai at the FCC, Scott Gottlieb at the Food and Drug Administration, and Naomi Rao at the Office of Regulatory Affairs at OMB, the regulatory czarina for the whole executive branch. Are people that are at a minimum earnest, serious, deeply knowledgeable experts in the fields, in these three very important fields. The president likes to sign executive orders and call the media into his office, but none of these executive orders raise the sorts of problems that many people worried about of glomming on to what were pretty clearly legislative powers. In many cases, statutes that had been, acts that had been criticized as going beyond the executive branch's authorities, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Energy rules, net neutrality, the fiduciary rule, and several others. Are not being dispatched unilaterally. They are going to be the subject either of enforcement, changes in position in the courts, or full notice and comment rulemaking governed by such as the State Farm Doctrine. In enforcement, the Attorney General Jeff Sessions has done something that I hope Jennifer Arlen will like, which has been to put an end to the practice going back at least to the Bush administration of pretrial diversion agreements, non-prosecution agreements that involve having the defendants agree to make big charitable donations to the prosecutor's favorite charities. I'm stating this a little unfairly, but there has been a good deal of that. And that has been called off. And in
You can't call them charities.
In several areas of discretion, especially at the Energy Department and the Interior Department, there has been a very quick turnaround in the use of permitting to slow down development projects. Some of you may say, well, I wanted to slow down those development projects. I hate them. I offer those as positive examples because that actually was a front and center issue in the election. So we're actually seeing some responsiveness. And it really does occur to me that for all the talk of the deep state and how the bureaucracy has declared war on the Trump administration and is sabotaging all that it's trying to do, well, I see a good deal of that in the intelligence community. In the regulatory agencies, what is striking to me is how the agencies, faced with the sharpest change in policy perspectives, at any time that I can remember. It's much bigger than the Reagan replacing Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton replacing George H.W. Bush, that the bureaucracy seems to be actually quite responsive. And you see the new management, and often it's only one person, and they don't even have deputies around. They don't even have a general counsel around. What I see as an insider in Washington is that the agencies are, I'm sure that there's more to it. You know, if we had a few drinks with Scott Pruitt, he could tell us about the hostile workplace environment that he's facing and give us some colorful anecdotes. But in general, the regulatory agencies are being responsive to the new political management, and I count that as a good step for the progress of the rule of law and our political system. However, virtually everything I've mentioned consists of administrative steps. A conservative administration is taking advantage of features of our political system that conservatives have been complaining about for years, which is that the executive branch actually does have an enormous amount of discretion, and they are using that discretion in ways that can accomplish what they want within a certain realm. You know, going through rulemaking, enforcement, permitting, and so forth, that they can undertake. The only exception is this Congressional Review Act, but that is a filibuster loophole. Every one of those 14 acts was enacted in the Senate by less than 60 votes. If it had not been for that being a congressional loophole, essentially none of them would have passed. When it comes to the question of statutory change to regulation, beginning with Dodd-Frank, near and dear to Charlie Calamaris's heart, we are dealing with a 60-vote Senate. They will not get the votes. They won't get the votes for that or anything. Maybe they will get some votes for these modest changes in the Administrative Procedure Act that were discussed by Chris at the last session, but we're in a very different world, and statutory change in regulation is not what it used to be. When I was in Naomi's position, head of OIRA in the Reagan administration, we had in 1982, the Senate passed a regulatory reform bill going far beyond what anybody's talking about right now, 96-0. My counterparty in the Senate was Carl Levin, a quite liberal Democrat, and we essentially just sat down and worked this thing out. And it's true that we were going to have a tough go of it in the House, but they were not just posturing in the Senate. They took this seriously. We had a judicially reviewable cost-benefit standard for all new rules, not just mega billion-dollar, all new rules. And the idea of the president's reviewing rules was it was the hot thing in all the top law review articles, unconstitutional. I was a walking violation of the Constitution. The president cannot have anything to do with what those people at those nice folks at the Environmental Protection Agency are up to. But the Senate, 96-0, was willing to ratify that. So we're in a very, very different world. How much time do I have? However, so I think that we're not going to do much in statute, and I think that it's going to be mainly administrative actions. There will be wins and losses in the courts. So I would say that if President Trump and the Republicans are in office for 8 years, the headline for the administrative state will be Trump moderates Obama. In other words, we're just going to be having some slight little mid-course corrections, that the deep dynamics of the administrative state remain. They are strong, and they will continue. That is, the logic of displacing old-fashioned notions of adversarial law enforcement, division of labor between administration, enforcement, and so forth, old-fashioned notions of the rule of law, problems of high concentration of power and the abuses that can bring. I think that is all going to essentially continue. I think it will do so because of the growth. The growth in, I think, the consensus on having a very, very broad scope and detail of federal power. And consensus isn't the right word here, but a disappearance of John Wallace's limited government. That is, the disappearance of the idea from political debate of anybody making the suggestion that anything is beyond the power of the federal government, and also the disappearance of traditional social economic dynamics that buttressed restraints on government action. The political system, I think, is reflecting deep changes in our culture, in economics, and technology. It affects Republicans as well as Democrats, not quite to the same degree, but I think that it is still here. A few years ago at a conference like this, somebody asked me, can you think of a problem that's a serious problem in America that the federal government should do nothing about? And kind of threw me back, and I was looking around in the room, what was I going to say? And I came up with, yes, obesity, okay? If we do a survey of every member of the House and Senate and say, do you think that the United States Congress should take action against the scourge and epidemic of obesity, especially among the precious youth of America? I think that we'd get among the Democrats 100-0, and among the Republicans, 96-4, something like that. You get overwhelming support for that. So and I think if we asked about should the federal government set a national rule for bathroom rules for transgendered people, I think you'd get a partisan split on that these days, but I'm not sure how long it's going to last. One thing I've noticed is that at the education department, very deregulatory in many respects. So far as I can tell, complete silence on the Office for Civil Rights and what they're doing on the campuses and dating and all of these things. All of it done by guidance. Never could have succeeded in going through notice and comment rulemaking. So you think that would be kind of an obvious one? No, they're kind of backing off on that. If I can say, I just want to say in conclusion, I think there are two aspects to this problem of the dynamics of current politics. The first is that if the federal government can do everything, it's going to be an executive-centered government, because it's a little bit like the Senate that Vicki was talking about. The Congress we can't really change. It's too deeply embedded. And the Congress that we have is a Congress that cannot be efficient. It is extremely cumbersome by design. And if we are going to control thousands and thousands of aspects of social and commercial and private life, the Congress is just going to say, you guys figure it out. It's going to have to give them a lot of discretion. So as long as a consensus for big government is around, we are going to have largely a executive government. I'd like to conclude, though, by noting that another change at a sort of a micro level that is very striking to me, from the birth of federal regulation in the 19th century until about 20 years ago, regulation was to a strong degree rule-based. And by that I mean that the discretion exercised by executive officials needed to be justified. You had to explain it had to be justified in terms of the public interest. You had to explain why this was good for the public as a whole. The justifications were in terms of monopoly, externality, including externalities that states could not deal with. In other words, when we were regulating, we were actually correcting some structural imperfections, market failures in private markets, or in the structure of the federalist system. We were just coming in and we were making corrections. That's no longer the case. The lawyers in the room know that we have volumes of constitutional and statutory law on price regulation and what the government has to do to justify the regulation of a price and how far it can go and how far it can't go. It's been going on for years. Look at the price regulation provisions of the Affordable Care Act. Just says the Secretary can set the rates wherever she wants them. Period. End of sentence. You just do it. As Charlie Calamiris knows, in Dodd-Frank, the federal government can declare a corporation under plenary control of the national government by saying that it is systemically risky. All you have to be is a big firm with a lot of suppliers and a lot of customers, and they can say you're systemically risky and move in. So there are no principled, rule-based procedures anymore. Net neutrality. Nothing about monopoly, which was the justification of public price controls in the past. They just said that some businesses are going to be a common carrier for the benefit of the business model of some other businesses. You may be in for it or against it, but that's the justification. There's no principled justification in the appropriate role for government. And if you look up and down the line, I think in many environmental energy standards as well, we've seen that ideas of cost-benefit analysis, market failure, have given way to quite forthrightly paternalistic and redistributive explanations as being perfectly satisfying satisfying to the modern public. So I think that the loss of constraint is a big problem and one much deeper than what the Republicans or the Trumpians are going to do. And I must say that I think that the Regulatory Accountability Act is essentially a codification rather than an attempt at regulatory reform. I mean, if you read this and it says, now, you guys downtown, you can just, write something down and put it in the Federal Register for $1 billion for America, $1 billion. However, you got to have a hearing on some of the little facts, and you've got to really explain yourself well. This is a very, very big deal. Rulemaking, when it was written in 1946, was not about any billion-dollar decisions. And this act, which I think actually is one of these things that could pass, it is actually it will make some reforms, but I think it is essentially a codification of many of the deep problems that we've become accustomed to. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we didn't coordinate, but it turns out that I'm picking up almost exactly where Chris left off. What I want to do is examine a little bit more from the perspective of financial regulation, more specifically, this problem of the process of regulation. And the process has a structural element to it, who gets to make decisions and how they get to make decisions. You mentioned FSOC. I'll talk about some other examples. There's also the problem of the reliance on guidance, and I'm going to talk about how the reliance on guidance has contributed to the abuse of power and to what John Wallace defined earlier as systematic corruption. So that's the bad news. The bad news is that I think we can point, particularly in the financial realm, to some things that are pretty horrific that are coming out of the tendencies that Chris just described. Now, on the good side, you could say, well, how are things better than they were even 3, 4, 5 years ago? So I'm a born optimist, so I'll tell you how they're better. In general, they're better because we've never before had the Speaker of the House elevate rule of law reform to a platform that was one of the fundamental pillars of the Republican House platform. The Better Way has a whole pillar just devoted to trying to improve rule of law, which is very consonant with the things we've been talking about. Secondly, my colleague at Columbia Law School, Philip Hamburger, just got a Bradley Award. Well, okay, well, you say good for Philip. I say good for the concern about whether the administrative state's actions are appropriate, which, I think if you asked Philip, he would tell you that compared to 5 years ago, that's a lot of attention. He just got a whole page interview in the Wall Street Journal. Something's afoot here about this topic. With respect to the financial sector in particular, a brilliant financial economist just issued a book. So this must be an important topic, which all of you can buy online for $1, called Reforming Financial Regulation After Dodd-Frank. And a lot of the book is about process reform. And that's something very new, because if you go back and read what financial economists have been writing about for the past 20 years, they've pretty much been writing about costs and benefits of regulation, looking very much at sort of what happened, what banks have to do, what they spent, expenses, kind of expensing it and thinking about whether the expenses are worth it. They haven't really been asking questions like, is this creating unnecessary risk, difficulty of managing your business, or is this just deforming our democracy in a way that we think is ugly? And that's now something that at least some people, myself included, are looking at. But it's not just academics. The Treasury report that just came out about 10 days ago devoted a lot of space to rule of law thinking. Now, that doesn't mean that they'll follow through with it. But the fact that the Financial Choice Act that Jeb Hensarling just got through the House, which picks up on the Better Way principles that Ryan had elucidated, and that is also very much correlated with what's going on in the Treasury. These are things that really haven't been talked about before. Even in 2008, when the administration Treasury issued a white paper about structural reform of regulation, the focus there was just where should power be? What should the Fed control? What should the OCC control? It wasn't about process. I'll bet you that guidance versus formal rulemaking wasn't even raised in that hundreds of page document. But now it is very much raised. And part of what's going on there is that we really have gotten to a point where these costs are very visible. I won't say we're at a crisis level yet. Speaking of crisis, notice that the two economic historians in the first panel pointed to the fact that the reforms that they were describing in the 1840s and the 1880s and 1890s, those were both the result of crises, or at least largely, maybe not entirely, but what galvanized the Indiana reform, and certainly what galvanized the agricultural reforms that were discussed, had to do with crises, very big problems. Unfortunately, crises don't always work out so well in terms of regulatory reform and finance. In fact, most of the process concerns I'm going to list in just a minute or two are themselves the outcome of a crisis, because a crisis gave license to the administrative state to do whatever it wanted. And when everyone hates bankers, discretionary authority to give it to bankers is very popular. And so we have seen this last crisis actually accelerated the problem of empowering unaccountable discretion in the financial sector. Now, why should you worry? What's the problem there about these so-called violations of rule of law and process? Well, let's talk about something that, if you don't know about, you would say this is some newly discovered Franz Kafka play that I'm fictionalizing about. It's called Operation Choke Point. So what we do is we create discretionary authority in the Federal Reserve and the FDIC in particular over deciding how much capital your bank should have, Chris, as you're running it. How much capital is prudent? We don't just make it a rule, we make discretionary latitude for the regulators. And then the Attorney General of the United States realizes that there's discretionary latitude in the hands of the regulators. He makes phone calls to connect with political allies in the regulatory agencies. All of this is a matter of public record, not my invention, and says, there are 30 things I really don't like. There are 30 things I don't like. I don't like hate speech. I don't like pornography. I don't like lottery ticket sales. I could go on and on. And so I have an idea. And I don't like payday loans, and I don't like a lot of things, ammunition sales. And so what we're going to do is we're going to we can use unaccountable discretion to punish those industries because I don't like them. I can't do anything with legislation because some of these things are constitutionally protected, like hate speech or ammunition. But you can help me, regulators, and here's how. Let's invent something called reputational risk of banks. Let's say that if a bank allows lottery ticket sellers to have deposit accounts at the bank, that could harm the reputation of the bank. And given that reputational risk, the bank's going to have to hold more capital. And what you're going to do is you're actually not going to say that publicly. What you're going to say publicly is, we're very worried about reputational capital, and we're going to have to examine banks to see whether they have a reputational risk problem that might require something. That's all you're going to say. But then you're going to, when you supervise them, hand them a list of 30 activities and say, better make sure you don't have anybody that is your customer that's on that list. And because that's happening in the context of an examination, it's privileged. And the bank is not allowed to disclose that information. It's not allowed to say it. So what we've just created through discretion is a magnet for systematic corruption, which was used. This isn't hypothetical. This isn't a Franz Kafka play. This is the law of our land. This is how it's happening. Now, then we could talk about the CFPB and the FSOC and their structural problems. I talk about them in the book. But what's encouraging here is the courts are actually pushing back against both the FSOC structural problems and its unaccountable lack of any standards in its behavior, which the court says is not allowable, and the CFPB, which the court says its structure is more dictatorial than anything else. Its lack of process is not acceptable. And so, interestingly, maybe unbelievably, the courts have actually stepped in and put some limits on these two inventions of Dodd-Frank. The Fed, which created stress tests, which are secret, and therefore completely unaccountable, is now under pressure. And you'll see even the Fed is admitting that they have to do something to make this a more transparent process. So in closing, are things about to change? The good news is we're talking about regulatory process for the first time in the financial industry, partly because things are so extremely bad. The bad news is crisis isn't about to happen, and even if it did, it probably wouldn't fix it. So we don't know what's going to be the galvanizing force that's going to make this happen, and Chris gave us lots of reasons to believe nothing's going to happen. Here's a note of optimism. Why would there be a moment of bipartisan opportunity right now in these kinds of things? Because the Republicans, of course, are on the record of being in favor of these kinds of reforms. Now with Donald Trump in the White House, maybe some Democrats might be convinced that process reform would be a good thing. I mean, call me crazy, but I don't think it's completely impossible. So I think if we had a good political entrepreneur, like you were back in the day, in the 80s, who could convince some Democrats that rule of law process reforms were useful to them right now, given the Trump administration, that might be an interesting angle for us to pursue. But I'm not really very optimistic. Thanks for your attention.
So I'm speaking last on a Friday, never an enviable position. And especially after my two colleagues up here, Chris stole much of my outline, and
That's why I was sitting so close to you.
yeah, I wondered why. And Charlie ended on a note where I think I began a year ago, thinking that maybe the combination of Republicans being entrenched in a desire for regulatory reform would be able to make common cause, and maybe that's possible. That certainly has a theory behind it. I am becoming more like Chris, which is to say a little bit more pessimistic about that. So the panel is on prospects for regulatory reform. It seems to me regulatory reform could be viewed in two, a lot of boxes, but I'm going to put them in two different boxes. One is retail reform. This is reforming of the various actual regulations going on in the financial sector and the education sector and the various sectors. I think that the prospect for that, at least in the very short term, is pretty good. This is mostly driven by personnel who's being appointed to the various agencies, it'll be no secret to people who know me, and I'm not particularly an enthusiast for the gentleman who happens to be at the apex of the executive branch right now. But I do think that I know a number of people who have been appointed to responsible positions, and I'm fairly pleased. And I think Chris shares this view that there are a number of very sensible, public-spirited people, and that there's going to be a lot of reform at the retail level. It will be interesting to see what becomes of this, and particularly when reforms get to the courts. I was in the Justice Department in the middle 1980s and defended several regulatory initiatives then that I'm still baffled why the D.C. Circuit was so hostile to some of what was being done then. I don't understand what was motivating some of the hostility to I think, highly public-spirited changes in regulation. But there was, and if anything, I think we see those so-called judges, as they have been called, much more hostile to this administration than any time I've in my memory. So I don't know I don't know to what extent the courts are going to become an obstacle to retail regulatory reform. But in any event, it may come. Now, I think there's a difference between today and the last and Chris's day, in that I think in Chris's day they had a theory. And I do think that even retail regulatory reform requires a theory. Now, the theory, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but I would say if there was a theory, it was cost-benefit analysis. That is, we need to make sure that regulations actually do more harm than good, measured as objectively as possible. Excuse me, do more good than harm, and measured reasonably objectively. I suspect that's part of the theory today, but I don't really think that's at the heart of it. What I would like to see as the theory is the one that Jim Wallace emphasized for us, which has to do with the nature of regulation. That is, regulation whenever possible by general rule and principle rather than by case, highly discretionary, and therefore systemic corruption inviting a method, what I call a mother may I regulation as opposed to rule-based regulation. I'd like to see that as a general theme. Paul Ryan may be in that boat, but I don't think the president is, and I don't really it seems to me, in fact, we don't have a theory. That in fact, what we have is catch as catch can regulatory reform here and there, and my prediction is that will sputter out and won't have a great deal of staying power. Now, the second kind of regulatory reform, in addition to the retail level, is systemic reform of the processes. And I think that there has been a lot of academic interest in this. We see at least some lip service given to it by the administration, but I'm not at all persuaded that the president cares about this. And I worry that there is just not enough political interest in it. That is, it doesn't sound that important to people. You're going to get a whole lot more interest in whether bathrooms are transgendered than you're going to get in whether administrative agencies' abuse of guidance is going to be brought under some kind of set of rules. And so like Chris, I think I'm not particularly optimistic about this. And Chris, I love you, love what you're doing. I think it's magnificent that the ABA of all organizations is thinking about reform. And who can be against common sense, nonpartisan, what's the other word? Consensual? Yeah, consensual reform.
And plus spell check.
This is, who can be against this? But the reforms really don't amount to a whole lot. I'm really impressed by the idea that rulemaking will now be one word rather than two throughout the statute. There actually, as you explain it, Chris, I thought there's more depth and actually more substance than I had realized upon just reading the description. So I'm actually sort of for it, but I do think it doesn't get at any of what I would regard as the deep procedural, structural issues with the modern administrative state. I will just tick off a few. One real problem is the problem of the lack of interim relief. And so if an agency on highly dubious statutory grounds decides to impose a massively expensive set of regulations on the industry, it will take 4 or 5 years for this to get through the courts and eventually be slapped down, by which time the industry will have already spent the money and it will be a done deal. It means that judicial review is really, it's after the fact. It's a little bit like, Korematsu, if, they had decided to give relief several years after the war was over. I think we need some fast trigger, something like, a preliminary relief. But in fact, the proposals that Chris described go the other direction, that they embed the idea that there can be reversal without vacatur, which means even after you've gone through the several years of review and you've discovered that what the agency did was unlawful, they can still continue to do it and get a second try. I think it ought to be the other way around. I think we need some sort of fast-track judicial review to review and make sure that highly expensive things are not imposed upon the economy unless there's reason to believe in advance that they were lawful rather than the other way around. The problem of guidance is huge. I mean, Charles's examples from the financial sector are great examples, but they are all over. I don't quite know what to do. Will Bode gave a paper on this at this conference, 2 years ago? Last year, and we might all want to go back and look at this. I'm inclined, so Chris's proposals have a nice but small way of handling this by abolishing our deference but leaving Chevron deference, and I think that hadn't dawned on me just from reading the proposals. That's a kind of a nice idea, but how about a somewhat more radical idea than that, which is to say that if the agency has not embedded its policies in a notice and comment rulemaking, that not only will the court not give it deference, but the court will give it a kind of anti-deference, that there be a kind of rule of lenity borrowed from criminal law to be applied to agency enforcement actions where the policy has not gone through notice and comment rulemaking. So to shift to anti-deference as a way of trying to prod the agencies into doing things the way they ought to do. I think we need to take a serious new look at the rules of standing and rightness. And in any event, I think there's some major things. But since my time is up, I do want to comment on the times that we are in, and in particular, the way in which the personality of the president affects all of this. Because, Charles gave what it used to be my view that the identity of President Trump might be an occasion for people to come together across the lines. I don't know. I think it's going to be much more complicated than that. The way I see things, and this is, of course, highly subjective, is that we have a pretty intelligent and well-meaning administration headed by a highly erratic head of the administration. And I think and someone who is, as Chris said, wants to do everything by executive order, bring in the press, have tweets of various degrees of outrageousness. So it's like you have this government going on, and then you have a circus at the top. And here are two completely opposite, but both, I think, plausible interpretations of what this is going to do. One theory is that the press and the political opposition are so entranced by all the silliness, all the stupid tweets and Russia here and emoluments there and all this dumb stuff, right, that the real government doesn't get much attention. So there's actually some serious regulatory reform going on down there. They're doing some pretty good things, and they're not attracting the kind of scrutiny and attention and criticism that you might expect, because the president is is a lightning rod, and everybody's so upset about all this stuff that doesn't make any difference, and it's sort of stupid, and it's a protective shield against the things that are going on. That's the optimistic story. Of course, but equally plausible is that all of this tends to discredit everything that the administration does, and so that when when a serious, sober regulatory official does something, the press doesn't pay any attention to that. What they pay attention to is what did the president say about it, which is not going to be helpful, right? It will not address the merits. It will not. The president has neither the interest nor the inclination to understand why other people, the political opposition, disagrees, so that he can't engage with them and bring them and help them to see why maybe there could be some merit even from their point of view. And so the possibility then is that rather than being a shield, what this is this kind of like groundwater contamination, going down with everything that the administration loses credibility. And I just don't know which of those two things it's going to be. But either way, it just presents. Our politics is so dominated by the personality of Donald Trump that we're not talking about the serious questions either of retail regulatory substance or of overall structural regulatory reform that really are so important to this country. And here we are talking about this, right? But what's going to be in the paper tomorrow? It's going to be whatever the tweet was about, and I find that very depressing. I just want to thank the speakers today. I thought that I think this may be my favorite of the we've done 3 or 4 of these. I think this may have been the most productive yet. And the thing that particularly struck me is how the interplay between papers that appeared to be coming from different directions and about different things, how they enriched each other in a way which is causing me to think about a lot of things quite differently. Who'd have thought that the effort to cure foot and mouth disease in the 1880s would cause me to think so differently about the modern regulatory world? I loved that paper. And Jim, you just bring us back to what really matters in our constitutional system. And I could go on and with each, but I want to thank all the speakers for their just extraordinarily stimulating papers.
Here.
Thank you.